Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you're here. Get comfortable, because tonight we're stepping into Colonial America to discover the strange little habits that were once completely ordinary, from the way people slept and kept themselves clean to the curious routines that filled an ordinary day. Before we begin, if these quiet journeys into the past help you relax or drift off to sleep, leaving a like and subscribing helps this little channel find someone else who needs it too. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you might think. And while you're here, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Maybe it's a quiet evening in Pennsylvania, a cozy little home somewhere in Cornwall, or a cool night in the hills outside Brisbane. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. I really do read every single one. All right, my friend, are you comfortable? Good, let us begin. Mercy Whitfield did not sleep the way you do. She did not lie down at 9 and rise at 6. One long unbroken stretch of dark. Nobody in her world did. Not really. Though almost nobody in her world would have thought to remark on it, because it was simply how a night worked. She went to bed not long after the last of the light left the sky, sometime between 8 and 9 on an October evening in 1754, in a farmhouse a few miles outside a small town in the Massachusetts countryside, and she slept a first deep sleep for perhaps 4 hours. And then, somewhere in the deep hollow of the night, long before any hint of dawn, she woke. Not startled, not from a nightmare. She simply woke, the way a person wakes when a candle has burned down to its final inch, gently, almost on schedule. This was called, by those who gave it any name at all, the first sleep. And what came after it, that stretch of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, was its own separate thing entirely, with its own separate rhythm. Her husband, Josiah, a cooper by trade, a maker of barrels and casks and the wooden buckets that every household in the county seemed to need at least 3 of, stirred beside her around the same hour, not because she woke him. Their bodies had simply learned, over 11 years of marriage, to keep the same strange clock. He did not sit up. He did not light anything. He lay there for a moment in the dark, and she lay there beside him, and for a while neither of them said a word, because there was no need to fill that particular silence. This is the part I find myself circling back to, more than almost anything else about the way these people slept. The waking hour was not wasted. It was not treated as a malfunction of the body, the way you or I might treat 3 in the morning if our eyes snapped open and refused to close again. It was instead a kind of second room in the night, and people furnished it deliberately. Some prayed, some talked quietly about small things, the things a couple only says to each other in the dark when nobody else in the house is listening. Some got up entirely and tended the fire or mended a torn seam by the coals, or simply sat with their thoughts for the better part of an hour before climbing back beneath the quilt for what was called, with the same plain honesty, the second sleep. Mercy usually talked. That particular night she asked Josiah about a shipment of white oak staves he was expecting from a supplier 2 towns over, and he answered her in the low, unhurried voice of a man half in a dream still, and somewhere in the middle of his answer he trailed off, and she realized he had drifted back under before finishing his own sentence. She smiled at that, alone in the dark, the kind of small private smile nobody else would ever know about. And then she lay still and listened. The house made its own sounds at that hour, sounds she had come to know, the way you know the sound of your own front door. The particular creak of the roof beams settling as the night grew colder. A mouse somewhere behind the wall, doing whatever it is mice do at 3 in the morning. Her daughter Hannah, 9 years old, turning over in the trundle bed pulled out from beneath her parents' bed, murmuring something in her sleep that was not quite a word. And underneath all of it, the low, steady breathing of her younger son, Eli, 5 years old, tucked in beside his sister, one small fist curled up near his chin the way it always was. There is a particular kind of tenderness in lying awake in a dark house, and simply listening to the people you love breathing. I think that has not changed in 270 years, even if almost everything else about how Mercy Whitfield spent her nights has. She did fall back asleep eventually, somewhere in that unmarked stretch between the second sleep beginning and the rooster 2 farms over deciding it was morning, and when she woke again it was to grey light, and the particular chill that meant the fire in the front room had burned down to embers overnight. She rose before anyone else. This too was simply how the day worked. The first thing Mercy did most mornings, before the fire, before the children, before nearly anything else, was reach for a small frayed twig kept in a cup near the wash basin. Not a toothbrush, not as you would picture one. A stick, perhaps the length of a finger, chewed and softened at one end until the wood fibres separated into something almost bristle-like. She worked it over her teeth and gums for a minute or two, the way her mother had taught her and her mother's mother before that, and every so often she dipped the frayed end into a small dish of fine salt, sometimes mixed with a pinch of soot scraped from the inside of the chimney, and used that as a kind of abrasive paste. It tasted, by every account anyone left behind, thoroughly dreadful, salty and faintly bitter, and somehow smoky all at once. She did it anyway, every morning, because a person who did not tend to this small ritual was understood, quietly, and without anyone needing to say so aloud, to be letting something slip. Dental care in Mercy's world existed almost entirely on this scale of daily maintenance, because there was very little else available to her if maintenance failed. A toothache that did not resolve itself meant, more often than not, a trip to whichever tradesman in town happened to own a set of iron extraction tools, and that tradesman was as likely to be the local barber or blacksmith as anyone formally trained in medicine. Mercy had, in fact, watched her own mother lose a molar this way when she was a girl, sitting in a kitchen chair with a length of cloth clamped between her teeth beforehand for something to bite down against, and the memory of it was enough to make Mercy chew that little stick with real diligence every single morning of her adult life. Prevention, in a world with no anaesthesia worth the name, was not a virtue. It was survival. She was not vain, exactly, but she was not indifferent to her appearance either, and there is something worth sitting with in that distinction. Colonial New England prized a kind of visible order over anything resembling modern beauty standards. A woman was not expected to be striking. She was expected to be neat. Hair combed and pinned beneath a linen cap the moment she rose, because loose, uncovered hair in daylight was, depending on which town you asked, somewhere between mildly improper and honestly scandalous for a married woman. Mercy's own hair was a dark reddish-brown, and she kept it parted plainly down the centre and twisted back beneath that cap so thoroughly that Josiah once joked, early in their marriage, that he had honestly forgotten what colour it was until their wedding night, when she had finally let it down in front of him for the first time. She still blushed a little, remembering that, 11 years on. Her complexion mattered to her in a way that had nothing to do with vanity, as we would now use the word, and everything to do with class. Pale, unblemished skin signalled that a woman spent her days managing a household from the shade of a doorway rather than labouring under open sun in a field, and so Mercy, like most respectable farm wives, wore a wide straw hat whenever her work took her outdoors, and kept a small jar of rendered mutton fat mixed with rosewater on her washstand, worked sparingly into her hands and face against the drying wind of a Massachusetts autumn. It smelled faintly of lanolin and something floral underneath, not unpleasant exactly, just entirely unlike anything you would find on a drugstore shelf today. She would have laughed, I think, at the idea of a woman 2.5 centuries later paying good money for something so similar in a little glass jar with a much prettier label. Here is the part that tends to surprise people most when I tell them about it. Mercy Whitfield almost never took what you or I would recognise as a bath, not because she was unclean by the standards of her own time, but because full immersion in water was, in her world, viewed with genuine suspicion. Many physicians and household manuals of the period held that submerging the whole body in water, especially in the cooler months, opened the pores and let cold air or noxious vapours in, weakening a person's constitution and inviting illness. A full bath was, for most families, an occasional event, sometimes only a handful of times a year, and often reserved for warm weather when the risk felt smaller. What she did instead, daily, was what historians now sometimes call dry washing, though nobody in Mercy's kitchen would have used that phrase. She washed her face, neck, hands, and the parts of her arms visible below a rolled sleeve every morning in a basin of water warmed slightly at the hearth, and beyond that she relied heavily on linen. A clean linen shift worn directly against the skin, changed every few days, was understood to draw sweat and oil away from the body far more effectively than water ever could, at least according to the thinking of her time. The outer garments, the wool and cotton dresses and stays, were rarely washed at all, sometimes not for a full season, because the assumption was that the linen underneath was doing the real work of keeping a person clean. I want to be honest with you about something. It is easy, hearing this, to picture colonial New England as somehow grimy, and that is not quite fair to what was actually happening. Mercy changed her linen shift regularly. She kept her hands and face scrupulously clean by the standard of her day. She aired her bedding on sunny mornings, beating the feather bed with a wooden paddle out on the fence rail until the dust rose in little clouds that caught the light. She was, by every measure her own community used, a genuinely tidy woman. The measure was simply different from ours, built around linen and airing and daily partial washing rather than full submersion, and once you understand the logic underneath it, it stops sounding careless and starts sounding instead like a coherent system that made a certain kind of sense for people who had no way of heating enough water for a full bath without an enormous amount of labour and firewood to begin with. That actually is the piece people forget. Heating water for a proper bath meant hauling it, bucket by bucket from the well outside, and then heating it, bucket by bucket, over a fire that was already doing the work of cooking breakfast and warming the house. A full bath for one person could mean an hour or more of a servant's or a wife's labour, assuming there was a tub large enough in the house at all, which in Mercy's farmhouse there was not. What she had instead was a shallow wooden basin, barely large enough to stand a child in, and that was reserved almost exclusively for bathing the little ones, not the adults. Which brings us to Eli, 5 years old, who despised his weekly basin bath with the particular fury only a 5-year-old can summon, and who Mercy wrestled into that shallow tub every Saturday evening, with a combination of bribery involving dried apple slices and a firm hand that brooks no further negotiation. Hannah, at 9, had graduated to washing herself with rather less drama, standing at the basin each morning and evening with the brisk efficiency of a girl who had already absorbed, without anyone quite teaching it to her directly, exactly how a proper young woman was expected to keep herself. By the time Mercy had the children washed, dressed, and fed a breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with a little molasses, the sun was properly up and the morning's first visitor arrived at the door in the shape of Goodwife Ruth Pratt, a neighbour from the farm just down the lane, come to borrow a measure of yeast for her own morning baking. The exchange between the two women, brief as it was, followed rules so ingrained that neither of them would have described them as rules at all. Ruth was the elder by perhaps 6 years, and had lived in the parish her entire life, while Mercy had come to it only through marriage, and so it was Mercy who greeted her first, with a small bow of the head, and the words, "Good morning, Goodwife Pratt," before Ruth returned the greeting in kind. Titles mattered enormously here, in a way that can be hard to picture now. A married woman of respectable standing was Goodwife, or increasingly by the 1750s simply Mrs., followed always by her husband's surname, never her own given name, not by anyone outside her own household and closest family. Mercy would no more have called Ruth Pratt by her first name in casual conversation than she would have walked to church without her cap on. First names were reserved for husbands, for children, for God in prayer, and for the very oldest and closest of friendships, and even then, often only behind closed doors. Men removed their hats. This was perhaps the single most universal gesture of the era, and one that carried enormous social weight in its small variations. A man tipped his hat to an equal. He removed it entirely and held it against his chest when greeting someone of higher social standing, a minister, a magistrate, a wealthy landowner. Josiah, when the local minister passed him on the road into town that same morning, swept his hat from his head in one practiced motion and inclined his whole upper body slightly forward, and the minister, a stooped and authentically kind man named Reverend Ainsworth, returned the gesture with a small nod that acknowledged the deference without requiring Josiah to hold the posture a moment longer than necessary. Neither man thought about this exchange for more than the half-second it took to complete. It was simply the shape a greeting took, the way you or I might say hello without consciously choosing the word. Curtsies worked on a similarly calibrated scale for women and girls, and Hannah at 9 was already deep into learning the gradations of it from her mother, who corrected her constantly and without much patience for error. A small dip of the knee for a neighbour, a deeper, slower curtsy held a beat longer for the minister's wife or the wife of a magistrate. Hannah found this endlessly tedious to practice and endlessly embarrassing to get wrong in public, which was, of course, exactly why her mother made her practice it at home, in the kitchen, over and over, until the motion became something her body simply did without her mind needing to supervise it. There is something almost musical about how ordered all of this was, once you stop thinking of it as stiff formality and start thinking of it instead as a kind of shared choreography, a way an entire community signalled, constantly and mostly unconsciously, exactly where everyone stood in relation to everyone else. Nobody in Mercy's world found it exhausting. It was simply the grammar of being polite, learnt so early and so thoroughly that by adulthood nobody had to think about the rules any more than you think about which words come first in a sentence. Ruth left with her borrowed yeast wrapped in a scrap of cloth, and Mercy turned back to the morning's work, which today included a task she rather dreaded. Her sister-in-law, visiting from a farm 2 counties over, had brought her own infant daughter along, barely 6 weeks old, and the baby needed to be dressed for the day, which in 1754 meant something considerably more involved than it means now. Infants in Mercy's world were swaddled tightly, their arms and legs bound close against the body with long strips of linen wrapped round and round until the baby resembled, to modern eyes, something closer to a small mummy than a child free to kick and wave. This was not cruelty, and Mercy would have been thoroughly baffled by the suggestion that it was. The prevailing belief held that an infant's limbs were soft and pliable, prone to growing crooked or malformed without the firm, straight support that swaddling bands provided, much the way a young sapling might be staked to grow upright. Mercy's own mother had swaddled both her children this way, loosening the bands gradually over the first several months, and Mercy had done the same for Hannah and Eli in their turn, and she performed the ritual now for her niece with practiced hands, the baby fussing only briefly before settling into what appeared to be, if the infant's expression was any indication, a state of genuine contentment. I find this detail worth sitting with for a moment, because it runs so completely against instinct now. We tend to think of a baby's freedom to move as an unquestionable good, and in most ways it is. But there is something almost touching in realizing that swaddling, to Mercy, was not restriction at all, it was protection. It was, in her understanding of a fragile new body, an act of care every bit as deliberate as buckling a modern infant into a car seat, done for reasons that felt every bit as obviously sensible to her as our own reasons feel to us. Once a child grew past infancy, the expectations shifted again, and shifted quickly. There was no real concept of a prolonged childhood the way we now understand it. No extended stretch of years set aside purely for play and schooling before real responsibility began. By the time Hannah turned 6, she had already been given daily chores that were, by any modern measure, substantial. Feeding the chickens, helping card wool by the fire in the evenings, minding Eli when he was smaller, learning to sew a straight seam, then a more difficult one, then eventually enough to mend her father's work shirts without supervision. Children dressed too, essentially as small adults. There was no separate category of clothing designed around a child's comfort or a child's play the way there is now. Hannah wore a scaled-down version of the same kind of dress her mother wore, stays and all, a stiffened undergarment that shaped the torso and encouraged, from a very early age, the kind of upright posture a respectable woman was expected to carry for the whole of her life. Eli, until roughly the age of 5 or 6, actually wore skirts as well, a common practice for young boys of the period, not because anyone thought of him as anything other than a boy, but simply because skirts made the endless business of toileting a small child considerably easier than trousers did, and because the milestone of breeching, being put into his first pair of proper boys' breeches, was treated as a genuine occasion, a small ceremony marking his passage into being dressed and understood as a young man in training rather than an infant. That breaching had happened for Eli only that past spring, and Mercy still remembered how solemnly he had stood while his father buttoned him into his first pair of breeches, his small chest puffed out with an entirely new and rather delightful sense of his own importance. The midday meal, called dinner in Mercy's world, not lunch, a word that had barely begun to exist yet, was the largest meal of the day, eaten around noon when the sun stood highest and the morning's outdoor labour paused, and the way that meal was served would look, to modern eyes, almost startlingly bare. There were no individual plates for most of the family. Instead, thick slices of stale bread, cut several days old on purpose so they would hold their shape, served as what were called trenchers, a kind of edible plate that soaked up gravy and juices from whatever sat atop it. Mercy set one before each family member, ladled a portion of the day's stew, that particular afternoon a rich mixture of salt pork, dried beans, and whatever late-season vegetables remained in the root cellar, directly onto the bread, and the meal was eaten largely with a knife and the fingers, a fork being a utensil still considered something of a foreign affectation by many households of the period, more common on a wealthy Boston merchant's table than on a rural cooper's. Seating itself carried its own quiet order. Josiah sat at the head of the table, nearest the fire, a position that belonged to him not out of any particular ceremony, but simply because that was where the head of a household sat, full stop, in nearly every home in the colony. Mercy sat nearest the hearth and the pot, close enough to serve without rising more than necessary. The children sat where they were told, and ate what was put in front of them without complaint, because a child who complained about food in Mercy's kitchen very quickly learned that complaint changed nothing except perhaps the warmth of the look their mother gave them across the table. Grace came first, always, spoken by Josiah in a voice grown a little rough with years of use, a short prayer of thanks that varied only slightly from day to day, and the family ate afterward largely in a silence that would strike a modern dinner table as almost severe. Conversation at meals was not forbidden exactly, but it was not the free chattering exchange we might picture now either. Children in particular were expected to eat quietly and speak only when addressed, a rule Eli found nearly impossible some days, his small hand shooting up under the table to tug at his mother's sleeve whenever some observation about the chickens or the weather became too urgent to contain, only to be shushed with a look until the meal's end. And here is the detail that always catches people off guard when I mention it. That trencher of bread, soaked through with the day's gravy, was not thrown away once the stew atop it had been eaten. In many households, the softened bread itself became the final course, eaten last, soaked through with all the flavour of the meal it had carried. Nothing in Mercy's kitchen was wasted if it could possibly be helped, a philosophy that extended from the largest joint of meat down to the very plate the meal had been served upon. After the meal, Josiah returned to his workshop, a low timber building set a short distance from the house, where the afternoon's task waited for him exactly as he had left it that morning, a half-finished cask standing on end, its wooden staves bound loosely with an iron hoop not yet driven tight. Coopering, the making of barrels and buckets and casks of every size, was skilled work that took years to properly learn, and Josiah had learnt it from his own father starting at the age of 12, the way most trades passed then, hand to hand, within a family, long before any of it was written down. There is an object worth pausing on here, sitting on the shelf just inside the workshop door, a single wooden hoop, smaller and more roughly made than the others stacked around it, carved by Josiah himself the winter Hannah was born, intended originally as a practice piece, an exercise for a young cooper still perfecting the exact curve and tension a proper hoop required. He had kept it instead of discarding it, and it had become, over the years, something closer to a small household relic, sitting on that shelf through 11 winters, present for nearly every quiet conversation husband and wife ever had in that workshop. Mercy had never once heard him explain why he kept it. She had never once asked. Some things in a long marriage simply exist without needing an explanation attached, and this was one of them. The barrels themselves mattered enormously to a town like theirs, far more than a modern person might immediately appreciate. Everything travelled and stored in barrels: salted fish and flour, cider and gunpowder, nails and molasses, and a poorly made cask, one that leaked or split under pressure, could ruin an entire season's worth of preserved food, or spoil a merchant's shipment before it ever reached its destination. Josiah's reputation rested on the tightness of his joints and the true curve of his staves, and he took a quiet, unshowy pride in that reputation, the kind of pride that expressed itself mostly through the care he put into work nobody would ever specifically compliment him for, because good barrels were simply expected to be good. By mid-afternoon, a knock came at the workshop door, and two neighbouring farmers arrived to help move a section of stone wall that had collapsed along the property line, separating Josiah's land from the next farm over. This was the ordinary texture of rural colonial life, in a way that is easy to romanticize and slightly harder to actually picture in its practical detail. There was no county road crew to call, no fence company to hire. When something needed doing that required more hands than one household possessed, neighbours simply came, and the debt was understood to run the other direction whenever their own turn came for help. Josiah would spend 2 full afternoons that autumn assisting with a neighbour's barn raising, unpaid in any coin, because the entire economy of small favours that kept a farming community functioning ran on exactly this kind of quiet, unspoken reciprocity. Ruth Pratt had mentioned something in passing that morning, delivered in the careful, half-amused tone of a woman sharing a piece of news she was not entirely sure how to feel about. Her eldest daughter, 17 this past summer, had begun being courted by a young man from a farm on the far side of the parish, and the courtship had progressed to the point where, on his most recent visit, the two of them had been permitted to bundle. This was, without question, one of the stranger customs of the era to modern ears, and I want to walk through it carefully, because it is almost never what people assume when they first hear the word. Bundling meant that a courting couple, fully clothed, were allowed to lie together atop the bed, usually with a wooden board fixed down the centre to keep a clear division between them, or sometimes with the young woman sewn into a specially designed bundling sack that left only her face and hands free. This took place with the full knowledge and often the direct arrangement of the girl's parents, frequently in a room just beyond a thin partition wall where a mother or father could hear every creak of the floorboard and every word exchanged. The logic behind it, odd as it sounds now, was almost aggressively practical. Fuel and candles were expensive, and heating a separate parlour room for an evening of chaperoned courtship conversation cost real money that many rural families simply did not have to spare. Bundling let a courting couple stay warm, under the same shared quilt, in a house where the only heated room after dark might well be the one containing the bed everyone in the family slept in eventually anyway. It was regulated intimacy essentially, sanctioned by parents specifically because it happened under their own roof and within their own hearing, rather than in some unsupervised barn or field where nobody could vouch for what actually occurred. Ruth had relayed the whole thing with a kind of resigned humour, the tone of a mother watching her own daughter walk a path she remembered walking herself once, bored and all, decades before, and Mercy had laughed along with her, because it genuinely was a little funny, viewed from the safe distance of 11 years of marriage. But it had also set something quietly turning in Mercy's mind for the rest of the afternoon, a small private thought she did not share even with Ruth. Here is the thing about Mercy Whitfield that almost nobody in her household or her parish fully knew. She could write, not simply read, which was common enough among New England women of her standing, since reading scripture was considered a virtue worth teaching a daughter. Write properly, in a clear, careful hand, a skill her own father had insisted on teaching her as a girl, over her mother's mild objections that it was an unnecessary accomplishment for a farmer's daughter destined for marriage and a household of her own. And in a small wooden box tucked beneath a false bottom in her linen chest, wrapped in a scrap of oiled cloth to keep the damp away, Mercy kept a slim hand-stitched book of blank pages, and in it, perhaps twice a month, by the light of a single candle after the household had gone to bed, she wrote. Not a diary exactly, not in the way we would now picture one, full of feeling laid bare on the page. Mercy's entries were sparse, careful, almost coded in their restraint, a line or two about the weather, a private worry over Eli's persistent cough that winter before last, a single unguarded sentence written the week her own mother died, 3 years back now, that Mercy had never once read aloud to another living soul, and never would. It was the one part of her entire life that belonged to no one but her, not Josiah, not the children, not the parish, not the minister, not even God, exactly, though she supposed he knew regardless. Just Mercy, and the page, and whatever she needed, once in a while, to finally set down. I think there is something worth sitting with in that image. A woman who spent every daylight hour of her life visible, accounted for, folded into the rhythms and expectations of everyone around her, keeping one small private room inside herself that nobody else was permitted to enter. I suspect most of us, in one way or another, still keep a version of that room. Hannah's schooling occupied the middle part of most afternoons, though schooling looked considerably different from anything a modern child would recognise. There was no schoolhouse within easy walking distance of the Whitfield farm, and so Hannah, along with 4 or 5 other children from neighbouring farms, walked instead to the home of an elderly widow named Goodwife Cutler, who ran what was called a dame school out of her own front parlour for a modest fee paid in coin, or, more often, in useful goods, a sack of cornmeal, a length of woven cloth, whatever a family could spare. The tool of Hannah's early education was a horn book, a small wooden paddle with a single printed sheet fixed to its face and protected beneath a thin translucent sheet of actual cattle horn, shaved down until it was nearly transparent. On that single sheet sat the entire alphabet, uppercase and lower, a row of simple syllables, and almost always the Lord's Prayer printed beneath it all, since reading instruction and religious instruction were, in Mercy's world, essentially the same undertaking. Hannah had graduated past the horn book 2 years ago, moving on to something called a primer, a small stitched book containing longer passages, moral rhymes and simple stories, most of them carrying some lesson about obedience or godliness folded into the plot. Goodwife Cutler was, by every account Hannah brought home, a strict but not unkind teacher, quick with a ruler across the knuckles for inattention, but equally quick with a rare, genuine smile when a child finally mastered a difficult passage. Discipline in the schoolroom mirrored discipline everywhere else in a colonial child's world. Obedience was the primary virtue being taught, arguably even more than literacy itself, and a child who questioned an instruction, however politely, risked being labelled willful, a word that carried real weight and real consequence in a community this small and this interconnected. Boys and girls were taught somewhat differently even within the same small room. Hannah learnt her letters and her sums alongside the boys, but the arithmetic Goodwife Cutler pressed on her stopped at a fairly modest level, enough to manage household accounts and count change at a market stall, while a promising boy might be pushed further toward the kind of ciphering that could eventually support an apprenticeship in trade or, for a fortunate few, a path toward a college like the one in Cambridge that everyone simply called the college, as though there were only the one worth naming. Hannah did not resent this particular difference, not yet, not at 9 years old. It had simply never occurred to her that the world might arrange itself any other way, the same way it had never occurred to her mother at that age either. What Hannah loved best, and what she came home chattering about most days, had almost nothing to do with letters or numbers at all. It was the half hour at the end of each lesson, when Goodwife Cutler, her strictness softening a little as the afternoon wore down, told stories, old stories, some of them clearly embellished, about the earliest days of the colony, about hard winters and harder crossings, about her own grandmother, who had come across the ocean as a young woman and never once in 80 years of New England life stopped talking about the particular blue of the sea on a calm morning somewhere off the coast of England. Hannah repeated fragments of these stories to her mother most evenings, and Mercy listened every time as though she had never heard a version of them before, because there is a particular kind of love that simply means listening, again and again, to a child's excitement over something you have already heard. While Hannah sat in Goodwife Cutler's parlour, Mercy turned her own afternoon toward the small garden plot at the side of the house, mostly gone by now to the tail end of the season, though a few hardy plants still held on against the coming frost, sage still silver green along one edge. A stand of yarrow, its flat white flower heads dried and brittle now, waiting to be gathered. A patch of feverfew that Mercy checked on nearly every day this time of year, because feverfew, dried and steeped into a bitter tea, was her first line of defense against the headaches that sometimes settled behind her own eyes for a day or two at a time. And because it had, more than once, helped bring down a fever in one of the children when nothing else in her small store of remedies seemed to touch it. Medicine, in Mercy's world, belonged almost entirely to women, and specifically to women like her, mothers and grandmothers and aunts, who carried an entire working pharmacy in their heads, passed down mother to daughter with no book required, though some households did keep a written commonplace book of remedies, recipes for both food and physic jumbled together on the same pages, because the line between the two was considerably blurrier then than now. Mercy's own mother had taught her which plants eased a child's cough, honey and a strong infusion of horehound, warmed and given in small spoonfuls through the worst of a bad night, which poultice drew the heat out of a minor burn, plantain leaf, crushed and bound directly against the skin, which tea settled a stomach turned by bad food or too much excitement, peppermint, always peppermint, kept dried in a jar on the highest shelf specifically so it would be there the instant a child announced, usually at the worst possible hour of the night, that their stomach felt wrong. A trained physician existed in the nearest proper town, a full morning's ride away, and was reserved, by both distance and expense, for truly serious matters. A broken bone, a difficult birth, an illness that had already resisted every home remedy a family could muster. For everything else, and everything else was most things, a household relied on exactly the kind of knowledge Mercy was tending in her garden that afternoon, kneeling in the cooling dirt with a small basket beside her, gathering the last of the season's yarrow before the first hard frost took it entirely. There is something I find myself really moved by, thinking about this particular kind of knowledge. It required no formal education, no certificate, no permission from anyone. It lived entirely in memory and practice, refined generation after generation through nothing more than careful observation and the simple, unforgiving fact that a mother who got the remedy wrong might watch a child suffer for it. Mercy could not have named a single one of the chemical compounds actually responsible for the effectiveness of the plants she gathered. She did not need to. She only needed to know, with the certainty of 100 small successes behind her, that this particular grey-green leaf, crushed and applied just so, took the sting out of a burn within the hour, and that was knowledge every bit as real and every bit as hard-won as anything printed in a modern medical text. The garden work led naturally into the larger project that had occupied most of Mercy's October, the slow, methodical business of putting enough food away to see the family safely through a New England winter that could stretch, in a hard year, from the first snow in November clear through to a late thaw in April. This was not a task that could be rushed, and it was not a task that allowed for much error, because a poorly stocked cellar in January meant genuine hunger, not the mild inconvenience it would mean now. Apples had come in heavily that autumn, more than the family could possibly eat fresh, and so a good portion of the harvest had gone toward drying. Mercy had spent the better part of 3 afternoons the previous week, slicing apples into thin rounds, threading them onto lengths of string, and hanging them in long garlands across the kitchen rafters, where they would dry slowly in the warmth rising from the hearth below, until they shrank into small, leathery discs that could be stored for months, and later stewed back into something resembling their fresh selves. The kitchen for those 3 days had smelled almost unbearably sweet, apple and wood smoke tangled together in a way Hannah and Eli both claimed to love, and both, somehow, still complained about by the 3rd afternoon, tired of the sticky work of peeling. A separate portion of the apple harvest had gone to the cider press down at a neighbouring farm that owned the only such press for several miles around, a communal resource shared, borrowed, and repaired collectively by every household that relied on it. Josiah had spent a full day there in September, working the press alongside 3 other men from the parish, turning bushel after bushel of apples into barrel after barrel of raw cider, most of which would be left to ferment slowly over the winter into a mildly alcoholic drink that every member of the family, children included, would drink daily, since water from a shallow well was not always considered entirely trustworthy, and cider, thin and only lightly fermented for the children's portion, was viewed as considerably safer. The root cellar itself, dug into the sloped ground just behind the house and lined with fieldstone, held the season's harder work. Turnips and carrots packed in dry sand to keep through the winter months. Squash and pumpkins arranged along a shelf where the cool, steady temperature would keep them from rotting for weeks yet. Barrels of salted pork and salted fish, prepared back in the autumn slaughtering season, stacked against the far wall. A crock of pickled cucumbers Mercy had put up in August, and another of pickled beets, both sealed with a layer of melted wax to keep the air out. Standing in that cellar with a lantern, surveying the season's work laid out in neat, dim rows, gave Mercy a particular satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride, exactly, and everything to do with the quiet, physical certainty that whatever winter brought, her family would not go hungry through it. That certainty, hard-won every single autumn through weeks of unglamorous, repetitive labor, was worth more to her than almost anything else the season produced. The coming Sunday sat quietly in the back of Mercy's mind that whole afternoon, the way it always did by midweek, because Sunday in her world was not simply a day of rest in the loose modern sense. It was a day governed by its own detailed and largely unbending set of expectations that touched nearly every household in the parish equally, regardless of how any individual family privately felt about them. Saturday evening, not Sunday morning, was actually when the Sabbath began, following an old tradition of counting the day from sundown to sundown rather than midnight to midnight. Once the sun went down on Saturday, ordinary work stopped. No spinning, no sewing beyond what was already on the needle, no unnecessary travel, no loud play from the children. The house settled into a quieter, slower rhythm that would hold through the following evening, and Mercy used the Saturday hours before sundown to prepare everything the family would need. Food cooked ahead so there was no cooking required the next day beyond simple warming, clothes laid out and brushed clean, boots polished. Sunday itself meant the meeting house, a plain, unheated building at the centre of town that the whole family walked to together, weather allowing, a journey of the better part of an hour on foot each way. The meeting house held 2 full services, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, separated by a break at midday, during which families who lived too far to walk home and back again gathered instead in small nearby houses kept specifically for the purpose, called noon houses, where they ate a simple cold meal prepared the day before and warmed themselves, in winter, at whatever fire the noon house happened to offer. Seating inside the meeting house followed its own rigid order, every bit as calibrated as the curtsies and hat tips Mercy had drilled into Hannah. Families were assigned specific pews by a committee of town elders, reassigned periodically as a household standing rose or fell, based on a careful and occasionally contentious accounting of wealth, age, and reputation within the community. The Whitfields sat roughly a third of the way back on the left side, a position Mercy understood, without anyone ever needing to explain it plainly, reflected the family's solid but unspectacular standing in the parish, respectable, established, but not among the town's leading families who occupied the front pews nearest the pulpit. Sermons ran long, often stretching past an hour, sometimes considerably longer, delivered by Reverend Ainsworth in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the unheated room, even in the depths of a New England winter, when the cold inside the meeting house could be nearly as sharp as the cold outdoors, and families brought small foot warmers, metal boxes filled with hot coals, tucked beneath long skirts to keep some feeling in their toes through the duration. Eli, at 5, had not yet mastered the art of sitting still through an hour-long sermon, and Mercy kept a small collection of quiet, silent distractions in her pocket specifically for him, a smooth stone to hold, a bit of dried fruit slipped to him discreetly when his fidgeting grew dangerous. Hannah, older now, managed better, though even she admitted, only ever to her mother, and only ever in a whisper, that her mind wandered more often than she would like to confess in the actual sermon itself. By the time Josiah came in from the workshop that evening, The light outside had gone the particular deep amber it takes on in New England in late October, low and slanting, and already beginning to fade toward true dusk, and the family settled into the last stretch of the day the way they settled into it most evenings, gathered close around the kitchen hearth, where the single fire in the house did double duty, warming the room and providing nearly all the light anyone had to work by. Candles were precious in a way it is genuinely hard to picture now, when we can light an entire house at the flip of a switch without a second thought. Mercy made her own, twice a year, in a long and smoky process that involved dipping wicks repeatedly into a vat of melted tallow, rendered animal fat, layer after layer building up slowly until each candle reached a usable thickness. Tallow candles smoked more and smelled considerably less pleasant than the beeswax candles a wealthier household might afford, faintly of the meat fat they were made from, and Mercy had, more than once, caught herself wrinkling her nose at her own handiwork on a particularly warm evening when the smell hung heavier in the closed room. But tallow was what a Cooper's household could manage, and so tallow was what lit their evenings, 1 or 2 candles at most, reserved carefully and lit only when the firelight alone was not enough to see fine needlework by. Most evenings, in fact, the fire did the job well enough on its own, and it was by that warm, unsteady firelight that Mercy sat most nights working at whatever needed doing. That particular evening it was mending a torn seam in one of Josiah's work shirts, her needle moving in small, practiced stitches while she half listened to Hannah reading aloud from her primer at the table nearby, sounding out a longer passage with the slow, careful concentration of a child still building real fluency. Josiah, in the chair across from Mercy, worked at something of his own, whittling a small wooden toy, a crude little horse, for reasons he had not entirely explained except to say that Eli's birthday was coming in a few weeks, and a boy ought to have something new to play with. The spinning wheel stood in its own corner of the room, though it sat idle that particular evening, Mercy having finished the week's allotment of wool the day before. On other evenings, though, that wheel occupied hours of her time, turning raw carded wool into the thread that eventually became the family's clothing, and the rhythmic whirring hum of it running was one of the most constant background sounds of the entire household, present so often and so consistently that Hannah later claimed, as an adult, she could not properly fall asleep for years after leaving her parents' house without some faint mechanical hum somewhere nearby to replace it. There is a particular quality to a room lit only by fire and 1 or 2 candles that modern electric light simply cannot replicate, no matter how many warm bulbs and dimmer switches a person installs trying to chase it. Shadows moved. The light itself flickered, breathed almost, brightening and dimming in small unpredictable pulses as the fire shifted and settled. Faces caught the light differently depending on where a person sat, half illuminated, half given over to shadow, in a way that made even the most familiar face in the room look, every so often, briefly and strangely new. Mercy had lived her entire adult life inside rooms lit this way, and she still, on certain quiet evenings, found herself simply watching the light move across the wall for a moment longer than the task in front of her strictly required. Eli, still sleepy but not quite ready to admit it, wandered over from his corner of the hearthrug that evening to ask his father whether the winter coming would be a hard one, a question that had apparently been troubling him since overhearing 2 of the men at the stone wall that afternoon discussing exactly this. Josiah set down his half-carved horse and considered the question with the same genuine seriousness he gave most things Eli asked him, because in Mercy's world the answer to that question mattered enormously, and nobody had any reliable way of actually knowing it in advance beyond a collection of folk signs passed down and watched for every single year. He told Eli what the men had told him, that the woolly caterpillars seen along the roadside that autumn had shown unusually wide black bands, a sign, by old country reckoning, of a hard winter to come, that the squirrels seemed to be burying an especially large store of nuts this year, working with a kind of frantic urgency that the older farmers claimed they only showed before a actually severe season, that the corn husks had grown unusually thick, another old sign, and that all three signs agreeing with one another the way they had this particular autumn was, in Josiah's own words, about as certain as a body could get without simply waiting to see what actually happened. None of this had any real scientific basis, and Mercy privately suspected, though she never said so aloud in front of the children, that the signs were remembered far more reliably when they happened to match the winter that followed than when they did not, the way any pattern people are actively looking for tends to seem more consistent in memory than it likely was in fact. But she did not dismiss the practice either, not entirely, because there was something authentically useful in it beyond mere prediction. Watching for these signs meant watching the natural world closely, all autumn long, attentive to caterpillars and squirrels and corn husks, in a way that kept a farming family paying careful attention to their surroundings, and attention, in a world with no weather forecast beyond a farmer's own accumulated observation, was itself a kind of practical wisdom worth cultivating regardless of whether any individual sign actually predicted anything at all. Beyond weather, the household carried a whole quiet ecosystem of smaller beliefs and habits that shaped daily behavior without anyone treating them as formal superstition exactly, simply as the way things were done. Mercy would not think of stepping over a broom left lying on the floor, always walking around it instead, an old habit inherited from her own mother that she could not have explained the origin of if asked. A dropped knife in the kitchen meant, by old custom, that a male visitor would call before the day was out, while a dropped fork predicted a female one, and Hannah, delighted by this particular bit of household lore, had taken to deliberately watching the silverware at meals to see whether the prediction would hold, keeping her own small, informal tally in her head that she reported to her mother with great seriousness whenever the household actually did receive an unexpected visitor that matched. Wash day itself, which had fallen earlier that same week, deserves a moment of its own, because it was unlike almost anything a modern household experiences, condensed as it is now into the push of a single button. Mercy did not wash clothes daily or even weekly, the way a modern person might load a machine. A full washing, involving the heavier linens and clothing rather than the quick daily rinsing of a face and hands, happened perhaps once a month in a good season, sometimes less often through the depths of winter, when hauling and heating enough water became genuinely difficult, and hanging anything to dry outdoors risked it simply freezing solid on the line instead. The process, when it did happen, consumed the better part of an entire day, and left Mercy's hands raw and reddened by evening. Water hauled bucket by bucket from the well, heated over the fire in the largest pot the household owned. Soap made at home, months earlier, in a smoky, unpleasant process involving rendered animal fat boiled together with lye leached from wood ashes, the resulting soft soap stored in a crock and scooped out as needed, harsh enough on the hands that Mercy rubbed a little of her own rosewater and fat mixture into her skin afterward most wash days, trying to undo some of the damage the lye had done. Garments were scrubbed against a washboard, wrung out by hand with real physical effort, since the household owned no mechanical wringer, and hung to dry across ropes strung between the house and the nearest sturdy tree, weather permitting, or draped across chair backs and a makeshift line strung near the hearth on days too wet or too cold to dry anything outdoors. This was precisely why the linen shift worn directly against the skin mattered so much in the overall system of colonial cleanliness, that Mercy had grown up understanding without ever needing it explained in so many words. A shift could be changed every few days and washed in a smaller, more manageable batch, while the heavier outer garments, harder and more time-consuming to launder, could go weeks or even months between full washings precisely because the linen underneath was doing the daily work of keeping actual sweat and body oil away from wool and cotton that would otherwise need washing far more often than anyone had the time, water or firewood to manage. There is something worth noticing in just how much of Mercy's entire domestic world traced back to this single practical constraint, the sheer difficulty of producing hot water in useful quantity. Bathing, laundry, cooking, even the daily washing of hands and face, all of it shaped at some level by the reality that water did not arrive already warm at the turn of a tap, but had to be carried and heated and used with real deliberation, one precious potful at a time. The following evening brought something Eli had been looking forward to for nearly a week: a husking bee held at a neighbouring farm, one of the larger and more sociable gatherings the autumn calendar offered a farming community that otherwise spent most of its days working in relative isolation, household separate from household, field separate from field. A husking bee, at its most practical level, was simply an efficient way to get a large job done quickly. A farmer with a substantial corn harvest still sitting in its husks invited neighbours from across the parish to come strip the ears clean in a single evening, work that would have taken one family days to manage alone, but that a crowd of 20 or 30 people working together around enormous piles of corn hauled into a barn or open yard could finish before the last of the evening's light gave out. Everyone brought something to the gathering, hands for the husking itself, and often food as well, and the evening carried a sincerely festive air entirely distinct from the quiet, task-focused rhythm of an ordinary working day. And here is the detail that always makes people smile when I tell it. Buried somewhere among the piles of pale corn husks was, inevitably, the occasional ear that had grown with kernels of a deep, unusual red rather than the ordinary yellow, a natural variation that happened often enough to be expected, but rarely enough to remain truly exciting each time it turned up. And by a custom that stretched back generations, whoever found a red ear of corn earned the right to claim a kiss from whichever young man or woman nearby they chose, right there in front of the assembled crowd, to general laughter and good-natured teasing from everyone watching. Eli, 5 years old and entirely too young to have any real stake in this particular custom, still found the discovery of a red ear thrilling every single time it happened, running to show whoever was nearest with the same breathless excitement he brought to nearly everything at that age. Hannah, 9, was old enough to understand exactly what the custom implied, and young enough to still find the whole thing faintly embarrassing whenever it happened near her, ducking her head and pretending sudden intense interest in the corn pile in front of her, the one time a red ear turned up close enough that she worried, briefly, someone might expect something of her. The evening ended, as these gatherings often did, with food set out on long trestle tables, some cider passed around, and a fiddle produced from somewhere, played by a young man from the far end of the parish who was, by general consensus, not a particularly gifted musician but enthusiastic enough that nobody much minded. A few couples danced, simple country steps that required more good humour than actual skill, and Mercy stood near the edge of it all with a cup of cider warming her hands, watching Josiah attempt, with visible concentration and only moderate success, to follow the steps alongside her, and found herself laughing in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of a community gathered together, briefly, for no reason more urgent than the shared satisfaction of a good harvest brought safely in. A letter arrived from Mercy a few days later, carried the last stretch of its journey by a neighbour returning from town who had thought to check at the small tavern that served, informally, as the nearest thing the area had to a post office. It was from her younger sister, married now, and settled on a farm in Connecticut, nearly 4 days' travel away by the time any letter actually made its way there and back, and Mercy held the folded paper for a moment before opening it, turning it over once in her hands the way she always did, feeling the particular weight of something that had travelled so far to reach her. Letter writing in Mercy's world followed its own careful economy, driven almost entirely by the cost of the enterprise. Paper itself was expensive, and postage, when a letter travelled any real distance, was paid not by the sender, but by whoever received it, calculated by the number of sheets used and the distance the letter had travelled, a system that made every unnecessary word feel, in a very literal sense, costly. Mercy's sister had solved this problem the way many correspondents of the era did, filling a single sheet of paper completely, writing in her usual direction across the page, and then, once she reached the bottom, turning the sheet a quarter turn and writing a fresh set of lines directly across her own original text, creating a dense cross-hatched pattern that packed twice the words onto half the paper at the cost of making the whole letter considerably more difficult to actually read. Mercy was well practiced at deciphering this particular style, having grown up writing and reading letters exchanged this same way her entire life, and she settled by the window in the last of the afternoon light to work through it, her sister's familiar looping hand crossing itself line after line with news of a new niece born that summer, a difficult harvest, a neighbour's wedding. It took the better part of an hour to read the whole thing properly, holding the paper at careful angles to follow first one direction of writing and then the other, and Mercy would spend several evenings after that composing her own reply, equally careful with her words, equally determined to fit as much genuine news and affection onto as little paper as the format would allow. Time itself moved differently through Mercy's days than it moves through a modern one, structured not by the precise minutes of a clock face but by looser, more organic markers. The household owned no clock, an expensive item still uncommon outside wealthier homes, and instead told the hour by the sun's position, by the particular slant of light through the kitchen window, by the crow of the neighbour's rooster and the ringing of the meeting-house bell in town on Sundays and lecture days, audible faintly across the fields when the wind carried right. An hourglass sat on the mantel, used mostly for timing specific tasks, how long bread needed in the oven, how long a particular remedy needed to steep, rather than for tracking the broader shape of the day itself. This looser relationship with time, unhurried and largely unmeasured beyond the rhythm of light and labour, shaped the whole unhurried texture of a colonial day in a way that is genuinely difficult to fully imagine now, living as we do surrounded by clocks in every room and on every wrist. Cloth, in Mercy's household, was treated with a level of care that can be hard to fully appreciate now, in a world where a worn garment is simply replaced. Fabric took real time to produce, from raw wool or flax carried all the way through carding and spinning and weaving before it ever became a usable piece of cloth, and that labour made every scrap of it honestly valuable, valuable enough that almost nothing was ever thrown away. A shirt of Josiah's, worn through at the elbows past any hope of further mending, did not simply become rubbish, it was cut down instead, the still sound fabric salvaged and repurposed, perhaps into a smaller garment for Eli, perhaps into patches for another item still in service, perhaps saved entirely for the scrap basket that sat, always, in the corner of the kitchen, slowly filling with odd triangles and rectangles of fabric too small for any single practical purpose on their own, but too good to discard outright. That basket existed for exactly one eventual use, and Mercy had been adding to it steadily for months in preparation for a quilting bee planned for later in November, another one of those gatherings where individual, tedious labour became, briefly, a shared and actually pleasant social occasion. The final quilt, pieced together from a household's accumulated fabric scraps, functioned as something closer to a family record than simple bedding. Mercy could point to individual patches in the quilt currently on her own bed, and name exactly where each piece had come from, this triangle from the dress Hannah wore as a toddler, that square from a shirt Josiah had worn on their wedding day, this odd little scrap from her own mother's apron, kept and worked into the pattern the winter after her mother died, 3 years back now, a small deliberate act of remembrance stitched permanently into something the whole family used every single night. A quilt, seen this way, held actual history inside it, wearable, tangible, present in the room every night rather than tucked away in a box somewhere out of sight. Fine, even stitching, the kind that held the layers of top, batting and backing together, was traditionally the part of the process saved for a gathering rather than done alone. A finished quilt top, pieced by whatever household was hosting, would be stretched across a large wooden frame, and neighbouring women would gather around all 4 sides, needles moving in careful unison, gossip and conversation flowing freely across the frame in a way that made the day pass quickly despite the genuinely demanding, close work involved. Mercy looked forward to these gatherings with real anticipation, not only for the chance to finally finish a project that would otherwise take her weeks of solitary evening work, but for the particular, easy companionship of a room full of women all doing something useful with their hands while they talked, a kind of social intimacy built around shared, productive labour rather than around leisure alone, something Mercy suspected, quietly, that a great many women of later centuries might have thoroughly envied, had they known to miss it. The farm itself supported a small collection of animals, each with its own place in the household's daily rhythm, and each in its own way essential to the family's continued comfort through the coming winter. A pair of oxen, kept mostly for ploughing and heavy hauling, stood in a rough shelter attached to the barn, patient, enormous animals that Eli regarded with a mixture of deep affection and mild wariness, since one of them stood taller at the shoulder than Josiah himself, and Eli had not entirely forgiven it for once stepping, quite by accident, uncomfortably close to his bare foot the previous summer. A small flock of chickens scratched through the yard, tended primarily by Hannah, whose morning chore included gathering whatever eggs the hens had produced overnight, a task she performed with the brisk, slightly proprietary confidence of a child who has been given real responsibility and takes it seriously. The chickens themselves had names, all of Hannah's own invention, names that shifted periodically as her enthusiasms changed, and Mercy had long since given up trying to keep track of which particular hen currently answered, in Hannah's mind at least, to which particular name. There was a single milk cow as well, kept in a small shed of her own, and the morning milking fell to Mercy, a task she had performed every single day of her married life, rain or shine, sickness or health, because a cow does not pause her own needs to accommodate a farm wife's convenience. Mercy had grown, over 11 years, into a kind of quiet, unconscious skill at it, her hands moving in the practiced rhythm of milking almost without her attention needing to be fully present, leaving her mind free most mornings to wander over whatever the day ahead required of her while her body handled the task on its own accumulated memory. And there was the dog, a rangy, brown-coated animal named Duke, who belonged, in the loose, practical sense that defined most working farm dogs of the period, to the whole family equally and to no one in particular. Duke slept in the barn most nights, earned his keep chasing off whatever small predators might otherwise threaten the chicken coop, and had appointed himself, entirely without instruction, as Eli's near-constant shadow whenever the boy played outdoors, trotting along beside him with the patient, watchful devotion of an animal who seemed to understand, in whatever way a dog understands such things, that this particular small human required a bit of extra looking after. Animal care structured the very edges of every single day in a way that gave the whole household a kind of built-in discipline nobody had to enforce. The cow needed milking whether or not anyone felt like rising early. The chickens needed tending whether the morning was pleasant or bitterly cold. There was in this a particular kind of steadiness that Mercy had come to sincerely value over the years, a sense that the day had certain fixed points around which everything else could bend and flex as needed, points that did not care about mood or weather or how well anyone had slept the night before, and simply had to be met. A few weeks earlier, back in September, the town had held what everyone simply called Training Day, and it remains one of those colonial customs that tends to surprise people most, because it sat somewhere strange between military obligation and genuine community festival, two things that seem, at first glance, like they should have very little to do with each other. Every able-bodied man in the parish between roughly 16 and 60 was legally required to muster several times a year with the local militia, bringing his own musket, his own powder horn, and whatever basic equipment the law specified, to drill on the town common under the direction of whichever local officer had been elected to lead the company that year. Josiah attended these musters faithfully, not out of any particular martial enthusiasm, but simply because the law required it, and because a fine awaited any man who failed to show without good cause. The actual drilling itself, by most accounts, tended toward the informal and occasionally chaotic men of wildly varying ages and wildly varying enthusiasm attempting to march in something resembling formation under an officer who was, more often than not, simply the most respected farmer in town, rather than anyone with genuine military training. What made Training Day genuinely memorable, though, had almost nothing to do with the drilling itself, and everything to do with what surrounded it. The whole town turned out, women and children included, transforming what was technically a military obligation into something closer to a county fair. Peddlers set up small stalls along the edge of the common selling ribbons and small trinkets. Contests of strength and skill broke out informally among the younger men once the official drilling concluded, wrestling matches and foot races, and, occasionally, a rough sort of early baseball-like game played with a ball and stick that Josiah described to Eli afterward with more enthusiasm than he generally showed for describing anything. Mercy had brought a basket of food to sell alongside several other women, a small informal market springing up around the edges of the gathering, and had spent a really pleasant afternoon catching up with women from parts of the parish she rarely saw otherwise, families whose farms sat too far from her own for regular visiting, but who converged, along with seemingly everyone else in the county, on this single September afternoon. Eli had been utterly transfixed by the muster itself, watching row after row of men in their ordinary work clothes attempt to march and wheel and present arms with a solemnity that struck Mercy, watching alongside him, as both honestly earnest and just faintly, affectionately ridiculous, a whole town's worth of farmers and coopers and blacksmiths playing soldier for an afternoon under a bright, forgiving autumn sky. There is something worth noticing in how thoroughly a legal obligation, something that on paper reads as purely military and administrative, had been absorbed into the actual texture of community life until it became for most families simply one more occasion to gather, trade, court, gossip, and enjoy a rare full day away from the ordinary grind of farm work. Colonial life offered remarkably few such occasions across the calendar year, and communities, Mercy's included, seemed to have an instinct for stretching whatever occasions did exist as far as they would reasonably go. Watching Josiah that afternoon at the muster, easy and familiar among the other men of the parish, had set Mercy thinking, not for the first time, about her own wedding day, now 11 years behind her, and about how little it resembled the elaborate, carefully staged affairs that would come to define weddings in later centuries. She and Josiah had married on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, not because Thursday held any particular significance, but simply because it was a day both families could manage, a day that did not interfere with the essential rhythms of harvest or planting that governed the calendar far more strictly than any romantic preference could. The ceremony itself had taken place not in the meeting house, as many might assume, but in the front parlour of Mercy's parents' farmhouse, performed by a local magistrate rather than by Reverend Ainsworth, since marriage in colonial New England was understood primarily as a civil contract, a legal joining of two households and their property, rather than a strictly religious sacrament requiring clergy. Mercy had worn, that day, simply the best dress she already owned, a deep blue wool she had made herself the previous winter, rather than any special garment created solely for the occasion. There was no white dress, no particular wedding colour at all, beyond whatever a bride happened to already possess and consider her finest. The whole ceremony had lasted only a few minutes, a brief exchange of vows and the signing of a document, followed by a modest gathering back at her parents' house, neighbours and family sharing food that had been prepared over the preceding days, a bit of dancing once evening fell, and by the following morning both Mercy and Josiah were simply expected to return to the ordinary business of their newly combined household. No honeymoon, no extended celebration, life folding back into its usual working rhythm within a day or two at most. What struck Mercy most, looking back on it now from the distance of 11 years and 2 children, was how little romance, in the modern sweeping sense of the word, had actually factored into the match at all, at least at its outset. Her marriage to Josiah had been arranged with real input from both sets of parents, a sensible pairing between two respectable hard-working families, his father's trade solid, her own family's land holdings modest but sound. Affection was expected to grow after marriage, cultivated through the shared labour and shared responsibility of building a household together, rather than treated as a prerequisite that had to exist fully formed before the vows were even spoken. And it had grown, that affection, genuinely and considerably, over 11 years of shared mornings and shared worry and shared small jokes worn smooth from repetition. Mercy found herself watching her husband across a crowded training field that September afternoon, feeling something she suspected her own mother would have called simply contentment, unremarkable and unglamorous, and to Mercy entirely enough. She had married a good, steady man on a practical Thursday afternoon without a single flower or white dress in sight, and whatever love had come since had arrived slowly, earned rather than assumed, and felt, for exactly that reason, considerably more solid than anything built on a single dramatic afternoon ever could have been. Her sister-in-law's infant, still visiting and still requiring her daily swaddling, had been named, Mercy learnt during that same visit, after her own late grandmother, a common enough practice that carried more weight than a modern parent might immediately assume. Naming a colonial child was rarely a matter of simply choosing a sound the parents happened to like. It was, far more often, a small act of family diplomacy, a naming that honoured a particular grandparent, aunt, or deceased relative, chosen with real deliberation and occasionally real negotiation between two families joined by the marriage. Mercy herself had been named for her mother's own mother, and Hannah in turn carried the name of Josiah's grandmother, a woman Mercy had never met but had heard described so often and so vividly by Josiah's own mother that she felt in an odd way as though she knew her regardless. Eli's name had been something of a small departure from strict tradition, chosen instead from scripture, a common enough alternative naming path in a deeply religious community, and Mercy still remembered the slightly pointed comment her own mother-in-law had made about the choice, gently disappointed that no living or recently departed relative had been honoured by it, a comment Mercy and Josiah had absorbed with polite nods and quietly gone on calling their son exactly what they had already decided to call him. There was a particular fondness, too, for what were called virtue names, especially among families of a strongly religious bent, names like Patience, Prudence, Charity, and of course Mercy's own, chosen deliberately in hopes that a girl might grow to embody the quality her name described. Mercy had always rather liked carrying a name that doubled as a kind of quiet daily aspiration, though she readily admitted, with a small private laugh, that her own Patience wore considerably thinner by the end of a long day with two energetic children than her name might suggest it ought to. She turned her attention back to the considerably more immediate business of admiring her niece's tiny, sleeping face, newly named and newly swaddled and, for the moment at least, entirely and peacefully unaware of the long, warm tangle of family history she had just been folded into. Baking day arrived every week or so in the Whitfield household, and it reshaped the whole rhythm of the kitchen for the better part of a full day, because baking bread in 1754 bore almost no resemblance to the simple, contained process it would become once proper kitchen ranges and eventually electric ovens arrived to make the whole thing considerably more forgiving. Mercy's household did not own a separate oven built into the main hearth, as some wealthier homes did. Instead, she used a beehive-shaped brick oven built into the outer wall beside the main fireplace, a structure that had to be prepared hours in advance of any actual baking. Early that morning she built a substantial fire directly inside the oven itself, feeding it steadily for the better part of 2 hours until the brick walls had absorbed enough heat to glow faintly and hold a temperature capable of properly baking bread. Once the bricks felt right to her experienced hand, tested by holding her palm just inside the opening and counting the seconds she could comfortably keep it there, she raked out every last coal and ember, swept the oven floor clean with a bundle of twigs tied to a long handle, and only then slid the risen loaves inside on a long wooden peel, sealing the oven's opening with a heavy door to trap the heat evenly around the bread as it baked. The whole process required a kind of accumulated physical knowledge that no written recipe could fully capture, a knowledge built entirely through years of trial, error, and careful attention. Too much heat left in the bricks scorched the crust before the inside had properly cooked through. Too little left the loaves pale and underdone. Mercy judged it almost entirely by instinct now. The particular colour of the brick, the particular smell of the swept-out ash, a set of sensory cues she could not have easily explained to someone unfamiliar with the process, but that her own hands and eyes had learnt thoroughly enough that she rarely got it wrong any more. She baked enough bread on these days to last the household most of a week, a dozen or more loaves at once, because lighting and heating that oven represented enough labour and enough firewood that doing it daily, for a single loaf at a time, would have been wasteful in the extreme. The bread that emerged, dense and dark and considerably heavier than most bread eaten today, since the flour itself was coarser and less refined than modern milling produces, kept reasonably well over the following days, growing progressively staler and firmer, which suited perfectly well the household's ongoing need for trenchers sturdy enough to hold a meal without falling apart beneath it. The kitchen, on baking day, filled with a warmth and a smell that Hannah and Eli both associated, even decades later by their own account, with something close to the very definition of home itself, yeast and wood smoke, and the particular toasted sweetness of a fresh crust, a smell that drifted through the whole house and lingered faintly in the wooden beams for a full day afterward, long after the last loaf had cooled on the rack by the window. Clothing itself, beyond the mending and cutting down Mercy managed so constantly, represented one of the largest and most demanding categories of household labor across the entire year, and it began for most families long before a single stitch of actual sewing took place. Wool came first, sheared from the small flock a neighboring farm kept and traded for, in exchange for barrel work Josiah supplied through the year, an arrangement that suited both households well enough that neither ever bothered drawing up anything so formal as a written contract over it. The raw wool arrived matted and greasy, full of bits of hay and thorn, and required washing then carding, a laborious process of combing the fibers straight and parallel using a pair of flat wooden paddles studded with short wire teeth before it was ready for the spinning wheel at all. Mercy carded wool most evenings through the autumn months, her hands moving in that same practiced repetitive rhythm, building up a store of carded fiber ready to be spun into thread across the darker winter evenings ahead when outdoor work slowed and there was, suddenly, considerably more time to fill. Dyeing the finished thread or woven cloth relied entirely on what nature provided nearby, since store-bought dye was an expense few farming households indulged in regularly. Mercy kept a small mental catalogue of what each season's plants could produce. Onion skins, saved all year in a jar for exactly this purpose, gave a warm golden yellow. Walnut hulls, gathered in early autumn and left to rot slightly in a covered bucket, produced a rich, deep brown that stained her hands for days afterward no matter how thoroughly she scrubbed them. Pokeweed berries gave a startling temporary pink that faded disappointingly fast in sunlight, a colour Mercy used sparingly and mostly for small items that would not see much direct exposure to the elements. True, deep lasting blue required indigo, an imported dye too costly for regular use in a household like hers, and so blue clothing, when the family owned any at all, was treated with a particular care and reserved for the finest garments a person possessed, the very dress Mercy had married in among them. The stays Mercy and Hannah both wore beneath their outer dresses, that stiffened, structured undergarment shaping the torso into the upright posture so valued by the period, were themselves a substantial piece of construction built from multiple layers of sturdy linen stitched together around thin strips of whalebone or, in a household of more modest means like the Whitfields, sometimes reed or wood instead, channels sewn with the kind of small, dense, even stitching that took real skill and real patience to execute properly. Mercy had made both her own stays and, more recently, a smaller set for Hannah as the girl grew, and she took a genuine, quiet pride in the neatness of that stitching, running her thumb along a finished seam the way a person checks their own work for the satisfaction of finding it sound. There is a kind of thrift woven through every layer of this that is worth sitting with for a moment. Nothing about clothing, from the raw wool on a sheep's back to the finished dress on a woman's shoulders, arrived quickly or cheaply. Every single stage demanded hours of skilled, patient labor, mostly performed by women, mostly performed in addition to every other task already filling their days, and the resulting garments were treated, understandably, with a level of care and preservation that a modern closet, filled with clothes bought in an afternoon and discarded within a season, would find almost unrecognizable. Cooking, on an ordinary evening, unfolded entirely around the single open hearth that dominated the Whitfield kitchen, a fire that burned nearly continuously from early morning until the household finally banked it for the night, since starting a fire fresh each time, using flint and steel to strike a spark into a small nest of dry tinder, was slow and uncertain enough work that most households simply kept their fire alive around the clock instead, feeding it through the day and smothering it down to slow-burning coals overnight, rather than letting it go out entirely. The hearth itself was a small ecosystem of specialized tools, each suited to a particular task, and Mercy moved among them with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent her entire adult life cooking this way. An iron crane, mounted on a hinge at the side of the fireplace, could swing a hanging pot directly over the flames, or swing it back out again for stirring and checking, without Mercy needing to lean dangerously close to the fire itself. A trivet held a smaller pot at a lower, gentler heat off to one side. A reflector oven, a simple curved tin box open on one side, could be set close to the flames to roast meat or bake small items using reflected heat, turned periodically so the item inside cooked evenly on all sides. That particular evening's meal was a simple one, a pottage built from the last of the garden's turnips and onions, simmered slowly with a bit of salt pork for flavour in the large iron pot hanging from the crane, filling the kitchen through the late afternoon with a smell that drew Eli in from the yard well before the meal was actually ready, hovering near the hearth with the particular hopeful patience of a hungry 5-year-old who has learnt through repeated experience that hovering does eventually get rewarded, if not sped up. Cooking over an open fire demanded a constant low-level vigilance that a modern stove, with its precise adjustable dials, simply does not require. A pot could scorch on the bottom if left too long directly over flame, rather than move to gentler coals. Bread baking in the reflector oven needed turning at regular intervals, or one side would burn while the other remained pale. Mercy managed all of this while simultaneously supervising Hannah's reading practice at the table and keeping half an ear on Eli's ongoing narration of whatever elaborate game he was currently playing, with a set of carved wooden animals near the hearthrug, a kind of practiced multitasking that had become, over years of daily practice, entirely second nature to her. There is something worth noticing in how physically present cooking was, in a way it rarely is now. Mercy's hands, by the end of most days, carried the faint permanent smell of wood smoke that no amount of washing ever fully removed, a smell so constant in her own life that she authentically could not smell it on herself anymore, though visitors from town, on the rare occasions they called, sometimes remarked on it, kindly, the way a person remarks on something they find pleasant and familiar in someone else's home. Cooking, heating, and simply staying warm all traced back to that single fire, tended and fed and never fully allowed to go out, the true centre of gravity around which the entire household's day quietly revolved. A more formal visitor called at the Whitfield house later that week, the wife of a prosperous merchant from the nearby town, stopping briefly on her way to visit family further inland, and the small flurry of hospitality that followed offered its own quiet window into another set of rules Mercy had absorbed so thoroughly she barely registered them as rules at all anymore. Tea had become by the 1750s a thoroughly important social ritual among households that could afford it, imported at real expense from halfway across the world, and treated accordingly with a level of ceremony that plain cider or beer never received. Mercy owned a small store of tea leaves, kept carefully in a locked wooden caddy on the highest shelf, not because she feared the children stealing it outright, but because tea was valuable enough that a servant or careless household member helping themselves too liberally to it represented a genuine financial loss a family like the Whitfields could ill afford to absorb casually. She unlocked that caddy only for occasions exactly like this one, a visitor of some social standing whose call deserved to be met with real hospitality rather than the everyday cider or small beer the family drank the rest of the time. The preparation itself followed its own small, precise choreography, water heated separately and specifically for the purpose, never simply ladled from whatever pot happened to be simmering over the fire already. A modest set of china cups, Mercy's finest possession by a considerable margin, brought out from a cabinet where they lived wrapped in cloth the rest of the year, used so rarely that washing and drying them beforehand felt almost like handling something borrowed rather than owned. Sugar, another genuine luxury, offered from a small dish and taken sparingly, a single small lump per cup, since sugar too arrived from far away at real cost. Conversation over tea followed its own gentle rules as well, circling carefully around safe, neutral topics, family health, the weather, news of shared acquaintances, rarely straying into anything that might feel too personal or too pointed for a relationship built mostly around occasional, formal calls rather than close intimacy. Mercy asked after the visitor's own children, admired a small brooch the woman wore, offered the last of a batch of dried apple slices alongside the tea itself, and the entire visit, cordial and pleasant and carefully bounded, lasted perhaps 40 minutes before the woman rose, thanked Mercy warmly for her hospitality, and continued on toward her original destination. What strikes me most, thinking about visits like this one, is how much unspoken labor and unspoken calculation sat underneath even a simple social call. Mercy had assessed, within moments of the woman's arrival, exactly how formal a welcome the visit required, based entirely on the visitor's dress, her manner of speech, the particular way she had introduced herself. That assessment then dictated everything from which cups came out of the cabinet to which precious stores got unlocked from the highest shelf, a whole silent system of social reading and response that Mercy performed instinctively, the product of a lifetime spent learning exactly how a well-run colonial household was expected to receive whatever unexpected guest happened to arrive at its door. Market day in the nearest proper town fell roughly once a month for a household like Mercy's, and it required enough planning and enough of a journey that the whole family generally went together, loading whatever the farm had to trade into the back of a small cart Josiah drove, drawn by one of the oxen for the several hours' journey along a rutted dirt road that turned, in wet weather, into something closer to a genuine obstacle course of mud and standing water. Coin, actual hard currency, remained chronically scarce throughout the colonies, and a great deal of ordinary commerce still ran on barter or on running credit kept in a shopkeeper's account book, tallied and settled only periodically rather than paid in full at the moment of each individual transaction. Mercy brought a basket of dried apples and a quantity of finished wool thread to trade that particular market day, exchanging both through a conversation with the town's general storekeeper that involved more careful, good-natured haggling than a modern shopper would expect over a simple purchase. For a length of blue ribbon Hannah had been eyeing for weeks, a small paper of pins, and a promise of credit toward a future purchase of tea, since the store's own current supply had run unusually low that month. The town itself, modest by any later standard, still represented, to Eli especially, an overwhelming amount of novelty crammed into a single afternoon. A blacksmith's forge, glowing and clanging, drew him like a magnet, and Mercy had to physically steer him away from the open doorway more than once, worried equally about flying sparks and about the very real danger of a 5-year-old wandering too close to a working forge unsupervised. A print shop, its window displaying broadsides and the latest edition of a newspaper printed just weeks earlier, caught Hannah's attention instead, and she stood peering through the glass for a long moment before Mercy gently reminded her they had more errands yet to finish before the light failed and the long ride home began in earnest. Josiah, meanwhile, conducted his own business separately, delivering a completed order of barrels to a merchant who dealt in shipping salted fish down the coast, and collecting payment, a mixture of actual coin and credit against future supplies of iron hoops he would need for his next batch of casks, an arrangement negotiated with the same easy, practiced familiarity he brought to nearly every transaction of this kind. He had done business with this particular merchant for years now, long enough that the two men trusted each other's word on credit extended, without either feeling any particular need for the more formal, written contracts a stranger's business might have required. By the time the family began the long ride home, the light had gone properly golden and low, and Eli had fallen fully asleep against his mother's side in the jostling cart, worn out entirely by a day's worth of new sights and sounds that a modern child, surrounded by novelty at every waking hour, would likely have found almost unremarkably ordinary, and that Eli, in his own considerably quieter world, had found genuinely thrilling enough to talk about for days afterward. Watching Eli tear himself away from the blacksmith's forge that afternoon had gotten Josiah thinking, on the long ride home, about a conversation he and Mercy had been slowly circling for the better part of a year now, the question of what trade Eli himself might eventually take up, and when the formal business of apprenticeship might reasonably begin. Apprenticeship structured nearly the entire working life of a colonial boy not destined for farming alone, or for one of the very few professions requiring a college education. A boy typically began around the age of 12 or 14, bound by a formal legal agreement, an indenture, to a master craftsman for a term of several years, often extending until the boy turned 21. In exchange for room, board, and instruction in the trade itself, the apprentice owed his master obedience and years of labor, much of it, especially early on, involving the least skilled and least glamorous tasks the trade required, sweeping a workshop, hauling materials, tending a fire, long before he was trusted with any of the actual skilled work he had ostensibly come to learn. Josiah himself had apprenticed under his own father, a common enough arrangement that spared a family the sometimes considerable fee charged by a master outside the household, though it came with its own complications, a father who was also a master craftsman rarely making any particular allowance for a son's fatigue or frustration, simply because the relationship happened to run two ways at once. Josiah remembered those years with a complicated fondness now, the genuine pride of finally producing his first fully sound barrel entirely unsupervised, sitting alongside the memory of very real exhaustion and very real frustration at a father who held him to exactly the same exacting standard he would have held any other apprentice. Whether Eli would follow his father into coopering remained truly undecided. He showed, at 5, no particular aptitude either way, too young yet for anyone to reasonably judge, though Josiah privately hoped, without saying so directly to Mercy, that his son might show at least some interest in the family trade eventually, if only because Josiah already had a workshop, tools, and years of accumulated reputation ready to hand down, resources that would spare Eli the cost and uncertainty of apprenticing elsewhere from scratch. If Eli showed no interest, though, or if his temperament suited some other trade better, Josiah was prepared to place him elsewhere when the time came, with a blacksmith perhaps, or a printer, or any of the half-dozen trades a family of the Whitfields' modest standing might reasonably negotiate an apprenticeship toward. Girls, notably, followed no equivalent formal path. Hannah's education toward her eventual adult life was happening constantly, invisibly, folded into the daily rhythm of the household itself, rather than marked by any single formal indenture, learning to spin and sew and cook and manage a household's accounts simply by watching and gradually doing more of it herself, under her mother's steady supervision, until one day, presumably some years from now, she would be considered ready to run a household of her own entirely, without anyone having ever formally declared the moment her education officially began or ended. Play, for children like Hannah and Eli, occupied a considerably smaller portion of the day than it would for a child born 2 centuries later, squeezed into the gaps between chores and lessons, rather than treated as a central activity in its own right, but it existed nonetheless, genuine and enthusiastic, whenever the chance arose. Toys, when they existed at all, were mostly homemade, carved or sewn by a parent or older sibling, rather than purchased ready-made from any shop. The small wooden horse Josiah had been whittling by the fire, intended for Eli's coming birthday, represented a fairly typical colonial toy, simple, sturdy, and entirely handmade, likely to be treasured and played with for years precisely because it represented real time and real effort, rather than something easily replaced. Hannah owned a rag doll her grandmother had sewn for her years ago, its face embroidered rather than painted, its dress a scrap of the same blue fabric Mercy had worn to her own wedding, and the doll had travelled with Hannah through every stage of her childhood so far, considerably more worn and considerably more loved with each passing year. Games that required no equipment at all filled most of the actual play Hannah and Eli managed most days. Hide and seek around the barn and outbuildings, a simple game of tag that Eli insisted on calling by a name entirely of his own invention that nobody else in the family had ever quite managed to decode the logic of. Marbles, when either child could get their hands on a few, played in the dirt yard with real seriousness and occasionally real tears when a particularly prized marble was lost to an opponent's superior aim. Hannah, old enough now to be trusted with slightly more complex activities, had also begun learning a simple card game from her mother, played with a well-worn deck that had belonged to Mercy's own mother, an activity reserved for quiet winter evenings when outdoor play grew impossible and the family needed some way to fill the long, dark hours between supper and bed that did not require candlelight the household could not always spare. There is a kind of resourcefulness in all of this that I find really lovely to sit with. A stick in the hands of a colonial child with sufficient imagination could become a sword, a fishing pole, a walking cane for an elaborate game of playing at being an elderly grandparent, entertainment manufactured almost entirely out of imagination and whatever raw material happened to be lying around, rather than purchased ready-made and requiring nothing further from the child at all. Eli, that particular evening, spent a full contented hour arranging a small collection of stones by size along the hearthrug, narrating some elaborate story about each one that only he fully understood, and Mercy, watching him from her chair, found herself thinking that whatever her son eventually grew up to become, this particular capacity for finding an entire world inside a handful of ordinary stones was probably a gift worth hoping he never entirely lost. A thin, well-worn pamphlet sat on the shelf beside the hourglass, consulted often enough by both Mercy and Josiah that its pages had gone soft and slightly furred at the edges from handling, an almanac purchased fresh each January and treated, by the time autumn rolled around, as something closer to a trusted old friend than a mere reference book. The almanac offered considerably more than the weather predictions and phases of the moon most people now associate with the word. Mercy consulted it for guidance on when certain household tasks were traditionally best undertaken, based on the position of the moon and the signs of the zodiac, a system of timing that modern science would dismiss entirely, but that shaped real decisions in her household nonetheless: when to plant certain crops, when to wean a child, even by some almanac traditions, when hair ought to be cut for the healthiest future growth. Josiah, more skeptical by temperament than his wife on some of the almanac's finer astrological claims, still consulted it faithfully for its tide tables and its general weather patterns, useful information for a man whose livelihood depended partly on goods shipped along the coast. Beyond practical guidance, the almanac carried a considerable amount of what amounted to entertainment as well. Small bits of poetry scattered between the pages of calendar information, proverbs and moral sayings, occasionally a short humorous anecdote or riddle included specifically to give a farming household something diverting to read through the long dark evenings of a New England winter when few other printed materials might reach them. Hannah had taken to memorizing several of the almanac's proverbs, reciting them to anyone who would listen with the proud seriousness of a child who has discovered a genuinely satisfying new skill, though she occasionally garbled the wording just enough that Mercy had to bite back a smile while gently correcting her. The almanac represented, in many households like the Whitfields', one of only a very few printed items a family owned outright, alongside the family Bible and perhaps a single other devotional text, and it was read and reread throughout the year until the next edition arrived to replace it, its predictions checked against actual events with the same mixture of genuine faith and quiet private skepticism most people probably still bring to any forecast, whether printed in a colonial almanac or delivered by a modern meteorologist standing in front of a screen full of moving colours. Some things, it seems, really do not change quite as much as 3 centuries might suggest they should. Josiah stopped at the town tavern that same market day, a brief errand while Mercy finished her own business at the general store, and the visit, brief as it was, illustrated another whole layer of colonial daily life that operated almost entirely outside the household itself, a world that belonged, by custom if not by any formal law, mostly to men. More than simply a place to drink, the tavern functioned as the town's informal post office, its news exchange, its gathering point for anything requiring a public announcement, and its closest equivalent to a modern newspaper, since travellers passing through carried word of events from other towns and other colonies that might otherwise take weeks to reach a place like this by any more formal channel. Josiah spent perhaps 20 minutes there, drinking a single mug of cider and catching up on news with 2 other men he knew slightly from previous market days, learning second-hand of a dispute over a boundary line 2 towns distant, a piece of gossip about a scandal involving a merchant's runaway apprentice, and a rumour, unconfirmed and treated with appropriate skepticism by everyone in the room, about rising tensions with certain native communities further along the frontier, a topic the men discussed briefly and with evident unease before the conversation moved on to safer, more immediate concerns. Women rarely frequented taverns in this same casual way, their own social and informational networks running instead through church gatherings, quilting bees, and the kind of formal calls Mercy had received earlier that week, Parallel channels that carried much of the same essential information eventually, just filtered through different rooms and different conversations. Mercy learnt of most of what Josiah heard at the tavern second-hand, relayed to her that evening over supper in a shortened practical version, the boundary dispute and the runaway apprentice, though Josiah, with the same instinct that made him careful about which topics to raise around the children, left out most of the unsettled talk about frontier tensions, judging it correctly as the kind of news that would only trouble Mercy without giving her any actual way to act on it. There is something worth noting in how thoroughly information itself moved through personal, face-to-face channels in this world, carried physically from town to town in the memory and conversation of actual travellers rather than transmitted instantly the way it would be now. A piece of news from Boston might take the better part of a week to reach a rural town like this one, and by the time it arrived, it had usually passed through several tellings already, each one shading the story slightly, the way any piece of information does when it survives only by being remembered and repeated, rather than written down and preserved exactly as first reported. Mercy's sister-in-law, still visiting with her 6-week-old daughter, mentioned in passing one afternoon a custom from her own recent lying-in period that Mercy had nearly forgotten, one of those small, specific traditions that tends to delight modern listeners precisely because it sounds so wonderfully particular and so entirely unlike anything a modern new mother would expect. When a colonial woman gave birth, she was traditionally attended not by a single doctor, but by a whole gathering of women from her community, neighbours and relatives, who arrived at the house and stayed on for hours, sometimes the better part of a full day, offering practical help and steady companionship throughout. And baked specifically for this occasion, in many New England households, was something called a groaning cake, a rich, heavily spiced cake, dense with dried fruit and considerably more sugar and butter than an ordinary household would use on any typical day, prepared in advance by the family or by neighbours and served to the gathered women once the new baby had safely arrived, a way of marking the occasion with something actually festive and sweet, after what had understandably been a long and demanding day for everyone involved. Alongside the cake came caudle, a warm, spiced drink made from wine or ale, thickened with eggs and sweetened generously, traditionally offered to the new mother herself in the days following birth, believed to restore her strength and, frankly, to simply comfort her through what was universally understood, even without any of the modern vocabulary we might use now, to be a physically demanding and thoroughly exhausting experience. Mercy's own sister-in-law had been given caudle daily for nearly a week after her daughter's birth, brought to her bedside by whichever neighbour happened to be visiting that particular day, part of an entire informal system of care that meant a new mother in this world was rarely if ever expected to manage those first difficult days entirely alone. That period of recovery itself, called lying in, traditionally lasted a full month, during which a new mother was excused from most of her usual household duties entirely, her responsibilities absorbed instead by whatever combination of relatives, neighbours, and older daughters the household could muster, a whole community effectively stepping in to keep a family running smoothly while its newest addition and the woman who had just delivered her both had the time and quiet they needed to properly recover and settle. Mercy's sister-in-law described those weeks with genuine warmth now, weeks that had felt, at the time, almost like an entirely different rhythm of life, women dropping by daily with food and news and company, the baby passed from arm to arm around the room while her mother rested nearby, wrapped in a kind of collective, practical tenderness that Mercy, listening, found herself thinking modern new mothers, often managing so much of this transition in far greater isolation, might have real reason to envy. The very last of the harvest work concluded that week with what the parish called Harvest Home, a loosely organised but deeply anticipated gathering held once every household had finished bringing in its own crops, a celebration less formal than a proper holiday, but treated in practice with nearly as much warmth and anticipation. Families across the parish contributed what they could to a shared table set up in the largest available barn, and the resulting spread reflected an entire season's accumulated abundance laid out together for one single, generous evening. roasted meats considerably more plentiful on this one occasion than any single family typically enjoyed on an ordinary night. Every variety of vegetable the season had produced, prepared a dozen different ways by a dozen different households. Pies, an enormous number of pies, apple and pumpkin and mincemeat, each family's particular recipe subtly different from every other, and Mercy spent the authentically pleasant portion of the evening comparing notes with several other women over whose crust held together best and whose spicing struck the right balance, a friendly, ongoing rivalry that resurfaced, good-natured and entirely unresolved, at nearly every harvest home Mercy could remember attending. Music and dancing followed once the meal itself wound down. The same enthusiastic if imperfect fiddler from the husking bee returning for another evening's work, joined this time by a second musician playing a simple hand drum, and the barn filled with the sound of stamping feet and laughing voices well into the evening, considerably later than the household's usual bedtime allowed. Eli, thoroughly overtired and thoroughly overexcited in the particular combination unique to small children at evening gatherings that run past their normal schedule, alternated between bursts of frantic energy chasing other children through the barn's shadowed corners and sudden, complete collapses against his mother's skirts, until Josiah finally scooped him up, fast asleep before they had even reached the wagon for the ride home. There is a particular kind of gratitude that runs through a gathering like this one, not the formal, solemn gratitude of a church service, but something looser and more physical, expressed through shared food and shared noise, and the simple relief of an entire community that has once again successfully brought in enough to see itself through another winter. Mercy stood near the barn's open doorway for a while that evening, watching the warm lantern light spill out across the darkened yard, and listening to the fiddle carry faintly on the cold night air, and felt something she could not have easily named beyond a kind of deep, settled contentment, the particular satisfaction of a hard year's work finally genuinely done, at least for this one brief golden evening before the long push of winter properly began. Firewood, more than almost any other single task, dictated the shape of Josiah's autumn, because a New England household required an amount of it that can be sincerely startling to hear stated plainly. A family like the Whitfields burned through something in the range of 30 to 40 cords of wood across a full winter, an enormous quantity that had to be cut, split, hauled, and stacked entirely by hand, well before the first hard freeze made the ground too difficult to work, and the days too short and too cold to spend long hours outdoors at all. Josiah spent most of his free hours through September and October at exactly this task, felling trees from a section of woodlot at the back of the property that he managed carefully across the years, never taking more from any single area than the forest could reasonably regrow, a kind of practical, inherited conservation that had less to do with any formal environmental philosophy and everything to do with the plain fact that a cooper who exhausted his own woodlot too quickly would eventually have nothing left to heat his own house with. He split logs with a heavy iron wedge and a wooden maul, a task that demanded real strength and real technique in equal measure, and Eli, on the afternoons he was allowed to tag along, watched his father work with an attention that bordered on reverence, occasionally attempting to lift the smaller wedge himself with an effort that produced considerably more determination than actual result. The stacking itself followed its own careful logic, wood arranged in long, neat rows against the side of the house and the barn, split ends facing outward to shed rain and speed the final stages of drying, since freshly cut wood, however dry it seemed, still held enough moisture to burn poorly and smoke heavily if used too soon after cutting. Josiah always aimed to have the coming winter's wood already a full year seasoned by the time the cold set in properly, meaning the pile currently growing along the side of the house would not actually be burned until the following autumn, an entire year of patient accumulation standing between any single log split today and the actual warmth it would eventually provide. Mercy watched the woodpile grow through those weeks, with a satisfaction nearly equal to her own satisfaction over the filling root cellar, because the two mattered together, food and warmth, the twin foundations beneath everything else a household needed simply to survive a season that could, in a truly hard year, kill a family through cold and hunger as surely as any illness could. She brought Josiah cider some afternoons while he worked, watching him for a few minutes from the edge of the yard, sweat visible even in the cooling autumn air, and felt, watching him, something that was not quite worry and not quite pride, but sat somewhere comfortably between the two. The particular feeling of watching someone you love do hard, necessary work well. A small structure stood near the barn that saw its heaviest use this time of year. A low log smokehouse where Mercy and Josiah preserved much of the meat that would carry the family through winter, using a method that required patience above nearly everything else and that filled the whole yard on the days it was in active use, with a smell Hannah and Eli both associated as strongly with the arrival of true autumn as they associated the smell of fresh bread with baking day. Meat, salted first and left to cure for a period of days or weeks depending on the cut, was hung inside the smokehouse over a low, carefully tended fire built specifically to produce steady smoke rather than open flame, a fire fed with particular woods chosen for the flavor they imparted, hickory when it could be had, since it burned cool and slow and gave the meat a rich, distinctive taste the family genuinely looked forward to all year. The smoking process itself stretched on for days at a time, the fire tended continuously, never allowed to flare into true flame that might scorch the meat or, worse, burn the whole structure down, a real enough risk that Josiah or Mercy checked the smokehouse at regular intervals through both day and night during an active smoking cycle, adding fuel carefully and adjusting the small vents along the roofline to control exactly how much smoke built up inside. The resulting cured and smoked meat kept remarkably well through the coldest months, hung afterward in the coolest part of the cellar or the attic, sliced off in portions as needed through the winter, a method of preservation refined over generations precisely because it worked reliably in a world with no other way to keep meat edible for more than a few days at a time otherwise. Mercy had learnt the process from her own mother, who had learnt it in turn from hers, and she judged the readiness of a given batch almost entirely by colour, smell, and the particular firm texture the meat took on once properly cured, sensory cues built up over years of practice that she trusted completely by now, the same way she trusted her own hands to know, without conscious thought, exactly how much flour a given batch of bread dough still needed. There is something worth appreciating in how much of this entire seasonal rhythm, the harvesting, the drying, the salting and smoking, existed for exactly one purpose, buying an entire family enough time against a winter that offered no other reliable source of fresh food at all. Every task Mercy and Josiah undertook through these autumn weeks traced back to that same essential goal, and by the time the smokehouse finally went quiet for the season, its work done, the family's stores stood as complete a defense against a hard New England winter as 11 years of accumulated experience and hard, careful labor could possibly provide. The first true frost arrived that week, arriving the way it always seemed to, quietly overnight, so that Mercy stepped outside one morning to find the whole yard transformed, every blade of grass and every fallen leaf rimmed with a fine, glittering white that caught the early light in a way that made even the most ordinary corner of the farm look, for a brief hour or two before the sun climbed high enough to melt it away, honestly beautiful. Practical urgency sat tucked inside that beauty, though, and Mercy did not stand admiring it for long. A hard frost meant the last of the garden's more tender plants needed bringing in immediately, or accepting as lost for the season, and she moved quickly that morning, gathering the final tomatoes, still slightly green but better ripened indoors than left to the coming cold, and the last of the herbs she had not yet fully harvested, working with the particular brisk efficiency of a woman who understood exactly how much a single overlooked morning could cost a household's winter stores. The whole character of the days shifted after that first frost, in ways both practical and simply atmospheric. Mornings arrived colder now, cold enough that Mercy's breath showed faintly in the kitchen before the fire had fully built its warmth back up, cold enough that Eli required real convincing some mornings to leave the warmth of his bed at all. The light itself changed too, growing lower and more golden even at midday, the sun no longer climbing to the high, bright angle it held through summer, and the days themselves grew visibly shorter with each passing week, dusk arriving earlier and earlier until, by December, full darkness would settle over the farm well before 5 in the afternoon. Mercy had lived through enough of these seasonal turns now to feel them almost as a physical sensation rather than merely an observation, a kind of settling and narrowing of the household's whole world down toward the warm center of the kitchen hearth as the outside world grew colder and less hospitable by the week. There was a particular melancholy in it, if she let herself sit with the feeling for more than a passing moment, the long stretch of grey, indoor months ahead, the outdoor freedoms of summer and early autumn packed away now until spring finally, eventually, returned. But there was comfort in it too, a genuine comfort she had come to value nearly as much as she once valued summer's easier warmth, the particular closeness a family develops when winter forces them indoors together for months at a time, evenings spent by the same fire, the same four walls holding the same small collection of people through the darkest, coldest stretch of the entire year, a closeness that summer's freedom, for all its pleasures, never quite managed to replicate in the same way. With the cold properly settling in now, another small nightly ritual returned to the household that had lain dormant through the warmer months, one involving a long-handled brass pan that hung, the rest of the year largely forgotten on a hook near the hearth. The warming pan, filled each night now with hot coals raked carefully from the evening fire, its long wooden handle keeping the user's hand safely distant from the heated metal, was passed briskly between the bedsheets of every bed in the house before anyone actually climbed in, moved in smooth, steady circles across the linen to chase away the worst of the evening chill before it could settle into the mattress itself. Mercy performed this task herself most nights, working her way from Hannah and Eli's shared trundle bed to her own and Josiah's larger one, and there was a particular, small satisfaction in it, climbing at last into sheets that held real, gathered warmth rather than the flat, punishing cold of an unheated room in late autumn. Children's heads, meanwhile, went beneath a soft linen or wool nightcap each evening, a habit so universal across every level of colonial society that a bare head at bedtime would have struck most people as actually peculiar rather than simply unusual. The reasoning was almost entirely practical, heat lost through an uncovered head in a poorly heated bedroom representing a real and noticeable difference in overall warmth through a long cold night, and Mercy tucked Eli's small cap snugly over his ears each evening with the same unthinking, habitual care she brought to nearly every part of his nightly routine, though Eli, more nights than not, managed to wriggle it half off again before he had even fully drifted to sleep. Beds themselves, in a household like the Whitfields, were shared far more often than a modern family would find comfortable, driven partly by simple economy of space and partly by the same practical logic behind the warming pan itself, shared body heat making a cold night considerably more bearable than sleeping alone ever could. Hannah and Eli shared their trundle bed, pulled out nightly from beneath their parents' larger bed and pushed back beneath it again each morning to free up the room's limited floor space through the day, a sleeping arrangement that struck neither child as remotely unusual, since it was, quite simply, the only arrangement either of them had ever known. Mercy found herself thinking, some nights, about how differently a future household might arrange all of this. Separate rooms for every child, beds warmed by some invisible, effortless heat she could not begin to properly imagine, and the thought amused her more than it troubled her, a kind of idle, harmless daydream she allowed herself occasionally in the last quiet minutes before sleep, never expecting, and never particularly needing, any of it to actually come true within her own lifetime. Bedtime itself, once the warming pan had done its work, and the last of the evening's chores stood finished, followed its own quiet, unvarying sequence, one that Hannah and Eli both moved through now, with the easy, unconscious familiarity of a routine repeated every single night of their lives. Prayers came first, spoken kneeling beside the trundle bed, Hannah's voice steady and confident through the familiar words, while Eli's trailed off periodically into yawns he tried, with limited success, to swallow before they interrupted the prayer entirely. Mercy knelt beside them most nights, guiding the words when Eli's memory faltered, and there was something in that particular nightly ritual she genuinely treasured, the two small bowed heads beside her, the firelight catching the edges of Hannah's dark hair and Eli's lighter, still babyish curls, a moment of stillness that felt, most evenings, like the true quiet center around which the whole loud, busy day had actually been organized. Josiah joined for the final blessing most nights, his own voice low and rough, and then came the settling in properly. Eli tucked beneath the quilt with his small wooden animals arranged in careful order on the narrow shelf beside the bed, a nightly ritual of his own invention that he insisted on completing personally, refusing any offer of help even from Hannah, who had long since given up trying to hurry him through it. Hannah, older and considerably less ceremonious about the whole process, simply climbed in, pulled the quilt to her chin, and generally fell asleep within minutes, a talent Mercy privately envied more than she would ever admit to her own 9-year-old daughter. A single candle burned low on the small table between the two beds most nights, not out of any real necessity, since the fire in the next room provided ample light for anyone needing to move through the house, but because Eli, without some small point of light nearby, took considerably longer to settle, his young imagination filling the deeper shadows of an unlit room with possibilities Mercy suspected he would rather not have named aloud even to her. She let the candle burn for perhaps 20 minutes after tucking them in, long enough for both children to drift properly towards sleep, before returning quietly to pinch it out between two dampened fingers, a small habitual gesture that left the faint familiar smell of extinguished tallow hanging in the room for a moment afterward, mixing with the deeper, warmer smell of wood smoke drifting in from the hearth beyond. There is a particular hush that settles over a household once the children have finally thoroughly fallen asleep, a quality of quiet distinct from any other quiet the day offers, and Mercy, standing in the doorway of that small room most evenings, candle snuffed and darkness gathering gently around the two small sleeping shapes before her, found herself pausing there longer than strictly necessary nearly every single night, simply watching, simply grateful, before finally turning back toward whatever remained of her own evenings still ahead. With the children finally settled, Mercy turned back to the kitchen hearth for one of the last practical tasks of her day, a task that carried real weight in a household with no other reliable source of heat and no easy way to relight a fire quickly should it go out entirely overnight. Banking a fire properly was its own small, precise skill, one Mercy had learnt from her mother and refined further through 11 years of her own practice. She raked the evening's remaining coals into a compact, careful mound near the back of the hearth, away from any drafts that might fan them into open flame while the household slept, and covered them over with a thick layer of ash, insulating the glowing coals beneath just enough to slow their burning to the barest smoulder without extinguishing them entirely. Done correctly, a well-banked fire would still hold a core of live embers by morning, enough that Mercy could uncover them, add fresh kindling, and coax the whole fire back to a proper blaze within a few minutes, sparing the household the considerably more laborious process of striking an entirely new fire from flint and steel each and every morning. Done poorly, though, a fire banked too loosely might flare dangerously in the night, a real hazard in a wooden house with no modern fire suppression of any kind, while a fire banked too tightly might simply die entirely by morning, leaving the household to face a cold kitchen and the slow, frustrating work of starting fresh. Mercy checked her work that night with the same quiet, habitual care she brought to nearly every domestic task by now, watching the small orange glow settle and steady beneath its blanket of ash before finally straightening, satisfied, and turning her attention to the last few tasks remaining before her own bedtime. There was something almost meditative in this particular nightly ritual, standing alone in the mostly dark kitchen, the day's noise and motion finally stilled, tending carefully to the one element the entire household sincerely could not survive without through a cold New England night. Mercy had performed this exact task, in some form, every single night of her married life, and she had come to think of it, on the rare occasions she thought about it at all, rather than simply doing it, as a kind of nightly promise renewed, warmth carried carefully forward from one day into the next, an unbroken thread of small, steady care that had in 11 years never once actually failed. Josiah waited for her in the front room, having already banked the workshop separately and secured its door for the night, a habit as automatic to him as the fire banking was to Mercy, and the two of them shared, most evenings, a final quiet half-hour together before finally retiring, a small stretch of the day that belonged to neither household management nor parenting, simply to each other. They talked, that particular evening, about small things, the way they generally did, Josiah mentioned a piece of business he needed to attend to in town before the month's end, a debt owed him by a merchant whose payment had run later than he liked. Mercy raised the question of whether they ought to slaughter one of the younger hogs before the week's frost deepened further, a practical decision that would shape a good portion of the smokehouse's remaining work that season. Neither topic carried much emotional weight, and that, in its own way, was rather the point. This particular quiet half-hour existed less for the exchange of important information than for the simple, accumulated comfort of two people who had spent 11 years learning each other's rhythms well enough that even the smallest, most mundane conversation carried a kind of easy warmth beneath it. Josiah asked, toward the end of that half-hour, how her sister's letter had read, and Mercy relayed the news properly this time. The new niece, the difficult harvest, a small joke her sister had folded into the cross-hatched final lines that had made Mercy laugh aloud when she first deciphered it. Josiah listened with genuine attention, the way he generally did when Mercy spoke of her family, and offered in turn a small piece of news of his own, a letter he had received weeks earlier from a cousin considering a move further west, toward land recently opened for settlement, a topic that briefly turned the conversation more serious, both of them quietly grateful, in the end, that their own lives remained settled here, close to family and familiar ground, rather than facing the genuine uncertainty such a move would demand. There is a particular kind of intimacy built entirely from these small, accumulated evening conversations, rarely dramatic, rarely urgent, simply present, night after night, year after year, until an entire marriage comes to rest on a foundation made mostly of exactly this: small news exchanged by firelight, small jokes half explained and fully understood anyway, small silences that never felt uncomfortable because both people sitting inside them had long since stopped needing to fill every quiet moment with words. Mercy valued this half-hour, she realized, turning it over in her mind that evening as she often did, more than almost any other single part of her day, more even than the earlier busy satisfactions of harvest and household, because it was, in the end, simply hers and Josiah's alone, the one part of the day belonging to nobody else in the entire wide, demanding world beyond their own front room. Josiah retired not long after that, worn through from a full day that had started, as most of his days did, well before dawn, and Mercy stayed behind a while longer in the front room, listening to his footsteps fade toward their bedroom and the familiar creak of the bed frame as he settled in. She waited, as she generally did on these particular nights, until the house had gone properly quiet, until she could be reasonably certain no one remained awake to notice, before crossing to the linen chest tucked against the far wall. The false bottom lifted easily now, worn smooth from years of exactly this same careful motion, and Mercy drew out the small wooden box, the oiled cloth, the slim hand-stitched book within. She carried it back to the hearth, where a single low candle still burned, one she had kept lit specifically for this purpose, and settled into the chair closest to the fire's remaining warmth, the book open across her lap, a small stub of pencil, carefully sharpened, held ready in her hand. She did not write every night, not by any means, only when something in the accumulated weight of a day seemed to genuinely require it, and that particular evening she found herself thinking again of the letter from her sister, of the new niece sleeping somewhere in Connecticut tonight, of her own children asleep just beyond the next wall, of Josiah already drifting off in the room beyond that. She wrote in her small, careful hand, unhurried, taking her time with each word the way she rarely allowed herself to take time with anything else in her busy, crowded days, only a handful of lines in the end, a note about the frost that morning, the garden brought in just in time, a line about Hannah's growing confidence with her letters, a small private pride Mercy rarely voiced aloud even to Josiah, worried it might sound like boasting, a final line, shorter than the others, simply naming the particular contentment she had felt earlier that evening, watching her husband attempt those clumsy dance steps at the husking bee, a feeling she wanted, for reasons she could not have fully explained even to herself, to set down somewhere permanent rather than let dissolve, unrecorded, into the ordinary forgetting of an ordinary week. Reading the entry back once, briefly, by the low candlelight, she closed the book, wrapped it again in its cloth, and returned it to its hidden place beneath the false bottom of the chest, the whole small ritual complete in perhaps 15 minutes from start to finish. Nobody in the house would ever know this particular evening had contained this particular quiet act. That, Mercy had come to understand over the several years she had kept this private habit, was rather the entire point of it. Some things, held privately and never explained, seemed to matter more for the simple fact of their privacy. A small, warm secret carried alone, needing no audience at all to feel entirely, completely real. Mercy pinched out the last candle and sat a moment longer in the dark, letting her eyes adjust slowly to the faint orange glow still seeping from beneath the banked ash in the hearth, the only light left in the whole quiet house now. There is a particular quality to a room lit by nothing but a single bed of covered coals, a colour that is not quite orange and not quite red, low and steady and entirely without flicker, nothing at all like the restless dance of an open flame. Mercy sat inside that colour for a while, feeling the day finally fully settle out of her limbs, the accumulated small tensions of hauling water and kneading dough, and correcting Hannah's curtsy and chasing Eli in from the cold, all loosening now, one by one, the way they always did in this particular hour, in this particular chair, in this particular thin glowing dark. The house around her had its own settling sounds too, sounds she had grown so used to over 11 years that she rarely consciously registered them anymore, though tonight, in the stillness, she found herself simply listening for a while. The soft tick and shift of the timber frame cooling as the fire's heat receded from the room, a faint draught finding its way beneath the front door, stirring the hem of her skirt where she sat. Somewhere out past the walls, an owl called once, twice, and fell silent again, and further still, faint and carried on the cold night air, the low, distant bark of a neighbour's dog that was answered, a moment later, by Duke himself, stirring briefly in the barn before settling back into whatever comfortable heap of hay currently served as his bed. She rose eventually, her body moving through the familiar dark with the easy confidence of someone who did not need light to find her way through her own house, one hand trailing lightly along the wall as she crossed toward the bedroom, feeling for the particular rough patch in the plaster just before the doorway that told her, without needing to see it, exactly how many steps remained. The floorboards held their own small variations underfoot, one particular board just past the kitchen threshold that always gave a soft, low creak no matter how carefully she stepped, a sound so familiar by now that she barely registered it as sound at all, simply as a kind of confirmation, a small nightly marker that told her she was nearly there, nearly to the warm, dark room where Josiah already slept, and where her own side of the bed, warmed earlier that evening by the pan she had carried through herself, waited now to receive her. The air in the bedroom held a different quality entirely from the kitchen she had just left, cooler, quieter, thick with the particular hush that settles over a room where someone is already sleeping. And Mercy paused just inside the doorway for a moment, letting her eyes adjust further still, until she could make out the shape of Josiah beneath the quilt, the slow, even rhythm of his breathing filling the small dark space with a sound she had fallen asleep to nearly every night for 11 years, and had never once, in all that time, grown tired of hearing. Lying there now, settling slowly into her own side of the bed, Mercy felt beneath her the particular give and rustle of the mattress itself, a sound and sensation so constant through her whole life that she really could not remember a single night in either her childhood home or her married one spent on anything else. 2 separate layers made up the bed itself, stacked one atop the other, each serving its own distinct purpose. Beneath lay a straw tick, a large fabric casing stuffed full of dried straw, replaced fresh once or twice a year, usually right around harvest time, when new straw was most plentiful and the old, increasingly compressed and increasingly prone to harbouring whatever small unwelcome insects a summer's use tended to attract, could finally be emptied out and burned. The straw tick provided the bed's basic structure and firmness, and it rustled, quite audibly, with every single movement anyone made atop it, a sound Mercy had grown so accustomed to that she barely registered it as sound at all anymore, though she remembered, with real fondness, how endlessly delighted young Eli had been by that same rustling sound as an infant, giggling uncontrollably every time he rolled, and the whole bed crackled softly beneath him. Atop the straw tick lay the feather bed proper, a considerably softer and more comfortable layer stuffed with actual goose down and feathers, a genuine luxury item that represented real accumulated wealth in a household like the Whitfields, gathered slowly over years from the family's own small flock of geese, plucked carefully and stored until enough had built up to properly fill a large casing. Mercy's own featherbed had been part of her wedding dowry, sewn and filled by her mother over the better part of 2 full years leading up to the marriage, and she still thought of it, 11 years on, as one of the finest and most honestly cherished possessions she owned, sinking into it each night with the same small, grateful pleasure it had given her on her very first night as a married woman. Bedding required its own constant maintenance beyond the periodic replacement of straw. Mercy aired both the feather bed and the household's woolen blankets on sunny days whenever the weather allowed, dragging them out to hang across the fence rail or drape over a sturdy bush, beating them with a wooden paddle to loosen the dust and refresh the loft of the feathers within, a task that left her arms aching pleasantly by evening and the whole bedroom smelling, for a day or two afterward, faintly and pleasantly of fresh outdoor air, rather than the closer, warmer smell that gradually settled back in through weeks of steady nightly use. She had performed this particular ritual only a few weeks earlier, one of the last genuinely warm afternoons of the season, and lying now beneath the results of that labour, the featherbed still holding some faint trace of that crisp autumn air within its softness, Mercy felt a small, specific gratitude toward her own earlier self, the version of Mercy from 3 weeks back, who had done this quiet, patient work entirely for the benefit of the Mercy lying here now, warm and settling toward sleep on a considerably colder night. Her thoughts, drifting now the way thoughts do in the last stretch before sleep finally arrives, wandered toward the coming weeks, toward the Thanksgiving Day the colony's governor would soon proclaim, an occasion that bore only a loose resemblance to the holiday that would eventually grow from customs like this one, celebrated centuries later on a fixed date every family simply knew by heart. In Mercy's world, Thanksgiving was not an annual certainty at all, but a specific day of religious observance, proclaimed fresh each year by official decree, sometimes in autumn, sometimes at another point entirely, called whenever the colony's leadership judged the community had genuine cause for collective gratitude, a good harvest, deliverance from some feared illness, the safe conclusion of some difficult season. She did not yet know the exact date this year's proclamation would name, though word would come soon enough, carried the way most news arrived, through the meeting house and through travellers passing between towns, and once it did, the whole parish would observe it together, a day that combined solemn church attendance, considerably longer and more formal than an ordinary Sunday service, with the same kind of authentically warm, abundant family feasting that had marked the harvest home celebration only weeks before. Mercy already found herself lying there in the dark, turning over which dishes she might prepare, whether she would attempt the same rivalry-inducing pie crust that had drawn such spirited debate at harvest home, whether her sister-in-law and the baby might still be visiting by then, extending what had already become a thoroughly pleasant stretch of extra company in the house. This was, she thought, drowsily now, one of the particular pleasures colonial life offered, that she suspected a busier, more constantly connected future might eventually lose without quite noticing the loss, the way a single, deliberately proclaimed day of gratitude carried real weight precisely because it was not simply handed down automatically on the same fixed date every single year, but announced fresh, genuinely earned by whatever the community had actually lived through in the months leading up to it. This year, she thought, drifting further now, the reasons for gratitude felt plentiful enough. A good harvest safely gathered, a healthy family growing rather than shrinking, her sister-in-law's new daughter sleeping soundly just down the hall, a husband whose steady, careful work had once again secured them through another season. Small, unremarkable blessings, most of them, the kind easy to overlook in the daily press of ordinary chores and ordinary worry, and yet, lying here now in the particular soft, sinking stillness just before sleep finally claims a tired body, they felt, to Mercy, entirely and quietly sufficient. Sleep, when it finally came for Mercy that night, arrived the way it nearly always did, not as a single distinct moment she could later point to and say, "There, that was when I fell asleep," but as a slow, gradual dissolving, thoughts growing looser and less connected, sentences in her own mind trailing off before they properly finished, images drifting in without any clear reason for arriving when they did. She thought, briefly and without any particular order, of the red ear of corn at the husking bee, of Hannah's careful, concentrating face bent over her primer, of the particular weight of the warming pan's handle in her hand, of her sister's cross-hatched letter, of Josiah's breathing beside her, steady now, unbroken, already well into whatever dreams currently occupied him. The room around her had gone entirely dark and entirely quiet now, save for that same steady breathing and the faint distant creak of the house settling further into the deepening cold outside. Somewhere beyond the walls, the wind had picked up slightly, a low, steady sound moving through the bare branches of the trees along the property line. Not fierce enough to worry over, simply present, a soft continuous murmur that seemed, if anything, to deepen the particular stillness of the room rather than disturb it. Mercy's own breathing slowed to match her husband's, unconsciously the way it always did. Two bodies that had spent 11 years learning each other's rhythms, finding once again their easy shared cadence even here, even now, even entirely without either of them awake enough to notice the small daily miracle of it. Her hands, resting loosely now atop the quilt, still carried faint traces of the day's labour in them, a lingering roughness at the fingertips from the morning's mending, a trace of garden soil worked deep into the creases of her palm, despite the washing she had given them before supper, the particular ache that lived, most evenings now, somewhere across her shoulders from the accumulated weight of 11 years of hauling and lifting and carrying. None of it troubled her particularly. It was simply the honest, accumulated evidence of a full and useful day, worn the way a well-used tool wears its own particular marks, and she carried it into sleep the same unremarkable way she carried it through every ordinary evening, without complaint, without even much conscious thought, simply as the plain, familiar texture of her own body at the close of another day. The candle in the front room had long since burned itself entirely out. The fire in the kitchen hearth banked down to its slow, steady smoulder beneath the ash. The children asleep in their own small room, the whole house settling now into that particular hush that belongs only to the deepest hours of night, when every living thing beneath a single roof has finally fully surrendered to rest, and the house itself seems almost to breathe along with them, walls and beams and hearth all holding their collective quiet vigil until whatever hour, deep in the dark ahead, would eventually call some part of the household briefly back toward waking. And then, somewhere in that same deep, unmarked hollow of the night that had opened this whole story hours and hours ago, Mercy woke. Not startled, not from any dream she could later recall, simply woke, the way she woke most nights at roughly this same hour, her body keeping its own quiet clock regardless of season or circumstance, a rhythm built up over so many years now that it required no candle, no bell, no waking of any kind beyond her own eyes, simply opening, unhurried, into the familiar dark of her own bedroom. Josiah stirred beside her a few minutes later, the same way he generally did, and for a while, as always, neither of them spoke, the silence between them entirely comfortable, entirely unforced, two people lying quietly awake together in the deepest hour of the night with no particular need to fill the stillness with words. This time, though, Josiah spoke first, his voice low and slightly rough, with sleep still clinging to it, asking her, without any real urgency behind the question, whether she had heard the wind picking up earlier. She had. They talked for a few minutes, quietly, about nothing especially important, the coming Thanksgiving proclamation, whether the frost might hold off long enough for one more visit to town before the roads turned properly difficult. A small passing comment from Josiah about how well Eli's little wooden horse was coming along, nearly finished now, ready in plenty of time for the boy's birthday. None of it was information either of them strictly needed to exchange. It was simply the particular, gentle texture of two people keeping company with each other in the dark, filling this small second room of the night the way they always did, with nothing more than the easy, accumulated comfort of each other's presence. Mercy found her mind drifting, as it often did during this particular waking hour, back across the whole shape of the day just past, and further back still, across the whole shape of the season behind it. The first frost, glittering across the yard that single golden morning, the husking bee and the fiddle and Josiah's clumsy, good-natured attempt at dancing, Hannah's careful curtsy, finally, blessedly correct, Eli's small triumphant grin over some discovered red ear of corn, her own careful pencil, moving across the private pages of a small hidden book by candlelight, setting down thoughts belonging to nobody but herself. It was, she thought, turning the whole accumulated weight of it over slowly in her mind, an entirely ordinary handful of weeks, nothing about any single day especially remarkable on its own, and yet held together now, in this quiet, wakeful hour, it felt, somehow, like something worth the careful holding, worth the deliberate, unhurried noticing she was giving it now, here, in the dark, with her husband breathing steadily beside her once more, already drifting, she suspected, back toward whatever dream her own quiet talking had briefly interrupted. Beyond the walls of that small bedroom, the farm itself lay wrapped in the same deep settled quiet that had claimed the house, and if you could have drifted outward now, past the bedroom window with its small wavering panes of hand-blown glass, out across the frost-touched yard, and beyond, you would have found the whole property held in a stillness that felt, on a night like this one, almost complete. The barn stood dark and silent against the deeper dark of the sky beyond it, its single small window showing nothing now but black. The oxen inside settled deep into their straw, breathing slow and heavy in the particular patient way large animals breathe through a long winter night. Duke lay curled near the barn door, one ear twitching occasionally at some distant sound too faint for any human sleeper to register, a low bark rising in his throat now and then before subsiding again into silence, whatever half-dream currently occupying him resolving itself apparently, without any real cause for alarm. The chickens roosted in a tight feathered huddle in their coop, still and silent, saving whatever waking energy they possessed for the first grey hint of dawn still hours away yet. Nearby, the woodpile stood in its long, neat rows along the side of the house, rimmed now with a faint new frost of its own, patient and waiting, holding within its careful stacked bulk an entire year's worth of future warmth not yet called upon. The garden plot, mostly emptied now of its autumn bounty, lay bare and dark beneath the same thin frost, waiting out the coming winter the way gardens always do, dormant rather than truly finished, already, in some quiet, invisible way, beginning the long, slow work of preparing for whatever spring eventually asked of it. Beyond the immediate boundary of the Whitfield farm, the wider countryside stretched out in every direction beneath a sky Mercy had glimpsed only briefly through the bedroom window before settling back into the bed's warmth, a sky, on a clear autumn night like this one, truly thick with stars, far more visible and far more numerous than any modern sky, glowing with the scattered light of distant towns and cities would ever again allow. Neighbouring farms lay scattered across those same dark fields and gentle hills, each one holding its own small sleeping household, its own banked fire, its own particular collection of dreaming children and settled animals, separated from the Whitfield farm by fields and stone walls and the same patient, star-thick darkness that held every single one of them equally, this one particular night, in exactly the same deep and undisturbed quiet. Further still, along the rutted road that Mercy and her family had travelled together on market day, the small town itself lay equally dark and equally still. The meeting house stood empty and silent at the centre of it all, its careful hierarchy of assigned pews holding nothing now but shadow, waiting out the week until Sunday's twin services would fill it once again with the whole gathered parish, Reverend Ainsworth's voice, and the particular cold that even a full congregation's worth of bodies rarely managed to entirely chase from that unheated room. The tavern, so full of voices and news and a particular warm bustle of market day only that same week, had gone dark and quiet hours ago, its keeper and his family long since retired to whatever rooms lay above the tap room, the fire in its main hearth banked down just as carefully as Mercy's own, the mugs and benches standing empty now, in a room that had, only days before, held Josiah's brief, pleasant half-hour of cider and gossip and half-believed rumour from the wider world beyond the parish. Nearby, the blacksmith's forge stood cold, its fire fully extinguished rather than merely banked, since a forge required considerably more deliberate effort to relight than a household hearth, and was rarely kept burning through an idle night. Eli's beloved glowing spectacle from market day existed now only as a dark shape in a dark building, the anvil silent, the bellows still, waiting for morning and the blacksmith's own return before it would once again fill the street outside with its familiar ringing clang. The print shop, too, stood dark behind its small glass window, the broadsides and newspapers Hannah had paused to admire now invisible in the unlit gloom. The printer himself, presumably asleep somewhere above his own shop, his presses standing idle until whatever the next morning's work required of them. There is something worth sitting with in the particular way an entire town, so full of separate, distinct activity by day, folds itself so completely into a single shared stillness by night. The general store where Mercy had traded her dried apples and wool thread, the print shop, the blacksmith's forge, the tavern, all of it, every separate small world that had felt, on market day, like its own distinct and busy universe, now reduced to the same dark, quiet shapes along the same dark, quiet street, waiting together, patiently, for whatever the next morning's light would eventually call each one of them to become again. Closer to home, along the same lane that connected the Whitfield farm to its nearest neighbours, Ruth Pratt's household lay just as settled and just as quiet. Somewhere inside that dark farmhouse, Ruth's own eldest daughter, 17 and newly permitted the particular chaperoned courtship of a bundling evening, slept now in her own bed, that recent, faintly embarrassing custom already folded back into the ordinary, unremarkable rhythm of an otherwise perfectly ordinary household night. Ruth herself, Mercy imagined, drifting toward her own sleep now the same way Mercy had, was likely settled beside her own husband in much the same fashion, the whole shape of an evening's small domestic rituals, borrowed yeast and warming pans and banked fires, repeating itself in nearly identical form in farmhouse after farmhouse scattered across the same dark, frost-touched countryside. Mercy's sister-in-law slept somewhere down the hall in the Whitfields' own house, her infant daughter, swaddled snugly, settled beside her, both of them presumably deep in whatever rhythm of first sleep and waking hour a new mother and her 6-week-old daughter had already begun working out together, a rhythm considerably less settled than Mercy's own after 11 years of practice, but no less real for its newness, no less carefully tended by whoever else in that quiet house happened to be listening for the infant's smallest stirring. There is something worth noticing in this particular, quiet repetition, the way a single night in a small New England parish held, simultaneously, dozens of nearly identical small dramas of rest and waking, each household's fire banked in its own particular pattern, each family's prayers spoken in their own particular cadence, and yet all of it, somehow, part of one single, shared communal rhythm, an entire parish breathing together through the same long autumn night, none of them fully aware of just how closely their own private, unremarkable rituals mirrored the households scattered across every field and lane around them. Mercy had never once thought to frame it quite this way before, lying awake in her own particular waking hour, and the thought, once it arrived, settled over her with a kind of quiet, unexpected comfort, the sense of being held, however invisibly, within something considerably larger than her own small, familiar bedroom. Down the short hallway, in the small room where Hannah and Eli slept, a similar small stirring moved through the house that same hour, though neither child would remember it clearly by morning, the way children rarely do remember these brief midnight surfacings, even when they happen. Eli turned over in his sleep, murmured something indistinct that might have been a fragment of whatever dream currently held him, something about the wooden horse still waiting, unfinished, on his father's workbench, and settled again almost immediately, one small hand finding its familiar place curled near his chin. Hannah, older and generally a steadier sleeper, shifted only slightly, pulling the quilt a fraction higher against a draught that had found its way, briefly, beneath the door, before settling back into the same deep, even rhythm she had held since first drifting off hours earlier. Neither child woke fully, not the way their parents had, not enough to speak or think in any coherent way, simply enough to shift, to resettle, to find some small fresh comfort in the arrangement of quilt and pillow before sinking back down into whatever dream had been briefly, gently interrupted. This, too, was simply the ordinary texture of a colonial household's night, the whole family moving through these small overlapping rhythms of rest and half-waking, none of it especially remarkable, none of it requiring any parent's intervention or even any parent's full awareness, simply the quiet, continuous business of 5 separate bodies, 6 counting the newest small niece down the hall, finding their own way through the long stretch of a cold autumn night, each one held, in their own particular fashion, by the same deep surrounding quiet that had settled over the whole house, the whole farm, the whole wide sleeping countryside beyond it. Mercy, still lying awake in her own bed a while longer, caught the faint sound of Eli's small murmur through the thin wall separating the 2 rooms, familiar enough by now that she could recognize it without needing to fully wake or rise to check on him, and felt, hearing it, the particular small reassurance a mother learns to read from even the most wordless nighttime sounds her children make. All was well. Everyone, in their own separate room, in their own separate rhythm of sleep, remained safely, peacefully held within the same warm, banked, carefully tended house. Mercy felt her own eyes growing heavy again at last. That particular waking hour's quiet conversation with Josiah trailing off now into the same comfortable silence it always eventually settled into, both of them simply lying together in the dark, unhurried, in no particular rush to fall back asleep, and, for exactly that reason, drifting steadily closer to it anyway. This was the second sleep beginning, that other half of the night's rest, distinct somehow from the first, even though nothing about the room or the bed or the body lying within it had actually changed. She let her mind go loose again, the way she had earlier that same night, images and half-thoughts drifting through without any particular order or urgency behind them. The particular blue of her wedding dress, worn only that one afternoon and packed carefully away ever since. The smell of apples drying above the kitchen hearth, sweet and slightly smoky, clinging to the whole house for days. Ruth Pratt's small amused shrug describing her daughter's bundling evening. The weight of the warming pan's handle, the rustle of the straw tick beneath her, familiar sounds and sensations she had carried, essentially unchanged, through 11 full years of exactly this same nightly ritual. Somewhere beneath all of it, further down than conscious thought could easily follow, her body simply continued its own quiet, automatic work. Breathing slowing further, muscles she had not even realized were still faintly tensed, finally loosening entirely, the last stray threads of the day's accumulated effort dissolving away into whatever deep, wordless rest waited on the other side of these final drifting minutes. She was aware, distantly, of Josiah's hand finding hers beneath the quilt, a small, wordless gesture neither of them needed to comment on, and then aware of very little else at all, the room, the bed, the whole quiet house folding gently away from her, one soft layer at a time, until there was only the dark itself left, warm and close and entirely undemanding, asking nothing further of her at all. The fire in the kitchen hearth continued its own slow, patient work through all of this, unwatched now, unattended, coals holding their careful, banked glow beneath the ash exactly as Mercy had left them, keeping their quiet promise of warmth ready and waiting for whatever hour, still some ways off yet, would eventually call the household properly back toward morning. Until then, there was only this, the dark, the quiet, the particular deep stillness of a house and a family, finally, fully given over to rest. What dreams came to Mercy in the deepest hours of that particular night, she would not fully remember by morning, the way most dreams slip away almost the moment waking begins to reclaim a sleeping mind. Fragments of them, perhaps, might surface briefly over the following day, a half-recalled image of her mother's garden from childhood, long since sold along with the rest of her parents' old farm, or the particular sound of her sister's laugh, carried somehow across the miles that now separated them, or simply a wash of warm, wordless contentment with no clear image attached to it at all. The kind of dream that leaves behind only feeling rather than story. Night moved on around her regardless, indifferent to whatever her sleeping mind wandered through, the same slow procession of hours it always kept. The moon, well past its fullest phase now, tracked its familiar arc across a sky thick with more stars than Mercy would have had any occasion to count, even if she had been awake to try, and somewhere out past the edge of the property, a fox moved silently along the tree line, pausing once to test the cold night air before continuing on toward whatever business foxes keep at this particular deep hour, entirely unbothered by and entirely unnoticed by the sleeping household it passed. The frost thickened slightly further as the night deepened toward its coldest point, somewhere in that long, still stretch between midnight and the first genuine hint of approaching dawn, settling more heavily now across the bare garden plot, across the neat stacked rows of the woodpile, across the whole quiet, sleeping yard. Inside the house, none of this registered at all. The rooms held their own steady, banked warmth, fire and quilt and shared body heat all working together, exactly as they were meant to hold the cold entirely at bay through even the sharpest hours of an October night. Time, in sleep, moves in a way that resists easy description, hours passing that feel, to the sleeper, like no time at all, or occasionally like considerably more time than the actual clock, had there been one to consult, would ever confirm. Mercy's second sleep carried her through several hours this way, deep and largely dreamless by any memory she would later hold of it, her body simply resting, simply recovering, simply doing the quiet, essential work that a full night's sleep does for anyone fortunate enough to find it, undisturbed, in a warm bed, beside someone they love, in a house that has been carefully, deliberately prepared to hold them safely through until morning. The house itself, sleeping now around its sleeping family, had stood on this same patch of New England ground for nearly 30 years by the time Mercy first crossed its threshold as a new bride, built originally by Josiah's own grandfather in the early years of the century, and it carried, within its timber frame and its worn wooden floors, a kind of accumulated memory that Mercy had come, over 11 years, to feel rather than simply know as fact. That particular creaking floorboard, just past the kitchen threshold, the one Mercy no longer even registered as sound, had likely creaked in exactly the same spot beneath the feet of Josiah's own mother and her mother-in-law before that. Generations of women moving through this same modest kitchen, tending this same hearth, raising children in these same small rooms, each of them carrying their own private accumulation of small joys and small worries through exactly this same nightly darkness. Mercy sometimes thought of them, on quiet evenings like this one, not with any particular sorrow or heaviness, simply with a kind of easy, companionable curiosity, wondering what small rituals of their own they had kept, what quiet thoughts had occupied their own waking hours in the deep middle of their own long nights. There was comfort in this particular kind of continuity she had found, a sense that her own small life, however unremarkable it might feel some days amid the endless repetition of chores and seasons, existed within a considerably longer chain of exactly this same steady, careful domestic work, stretching backward through generations she would never fully know, and forward, presumably, through generations she would never live to meet either. Hannah, she thought, drifting now toward her own returning sleep, might well raise her own children in a house very much like this one some day, might tend her own hearth, might keep her own private book of quiet thoughts hidden away in her own linen chest, the whole pattern repeating itself forward the same way it had clearly repeated itself backward, each generation adding its own small, particular details to an otherwise remarkably steady, remarkably enduring shape. It was not a grand thought. Not one Mercy would have known how to properly explain if anyone had asked her to put it into words the next morning, but it settled over her now, in the deep quiet of this particular night, with a kind of gentle, wordless weight, the sense of being simply one link, sturdy and sufficient, in a considerably longer chain, holding her own small place in it, with the same quiet, steady care she brought to everything else in her carefully tended life. The deepest part of the night settled fully over the farm now. That particular stretch of hours, somewhere past the middle of the night and well before any true hint of morning, when the whole world seems to hold itself in a kind of suspended, breathing stillness, as though even time itself has slowed to match the pace of everyone and everything currently asleep within it. Inside the Whitfield house, nothing moved beyond the small involuntary shifts of sleeping bodies settling deeper into their own particular comfort, a shoulder turning slightly, a hand finding a cooler patch of pillow, breath slowing further still into the deep, even rhythm that marks the body's most restorative hours. Mercy lay curled slightly toward Josiah's warmth, one hand still loosely resting near his beneath the quilt, her face, had anyone been present to see it, entirely smooth and untroubled. Whatever small daily furrow of concentration or concern usually lived between her brows during waking hours, fully released now, dissolved into the particular, unguarded peace that sleep alone seems able to grant a person. The feather-bed held her the way it always did, familiar and yielding, and beneath it the straw tick, silent now, undisturbed by any further shifting, having settled into whatever configuration her weight had finally fully sunk into. The quilt lay heavy and warm across the whole bed, its dozens of small salvaged patches, the toddler's dress, the wedding day shirt, the mother's apron, all of it invisible now, in the darkness but present nonetheless, a whole accumulated history of the family, wrapped literally around the sleeping bodies it belonged to, holding them through the coldest, quietest hours of this particular October night. Outside, the frost held its steady grip across the whole sleeping landscape, the yard, the garden, the woodpile, the barn, all of it silvered now beneath a sky slowly, imperceptibly beginning its long, gradual turn toward whatever hour would eventually bring the first faint suggestion of returning light. Nothing about that turn was visible yet, not from inside the dark, quiet bedroom, not from anywhere across the whole sleeping parish, every single household held equally, for just a while longer yet, in this same deep, unbroken, thoroughly restorative dark. Somewhere in the hours that followed, so gradually that no single moment could properly claim to be the one when night actually became morning, the deepest darkness began, almost imperceptibly, to soften. Not light yet, not anything a waking eye could have named or pointed to, simply the faintest loosening of the absolute black that had held the whole sky since well before Mercy had first climbed into bed the previous evening, a change so gradual and so subtle that it belonged more to feeling than to actual sight. The frost outside had reached its deepest point some while earlier, and now, with that same slow, imperceptible patience, began its own equally gradual retreat, the coldest hour of the whole long night already, quietly, behind it. Somewhere out past the barn, a single bird stirred, some early riser among the local flock, testing a few uncertain notes into the still, dark air, quickly falling silent again, not yet ready to properly begin the fuller chorus that would eventually announce true morning, but marking, nonetheless, some small internal shift that told it dawn, however distant still, was no longer entirely theoretical. Inside the house, nothing yet had changed. Mercy slept on, deep in the steady, restorative hold of her second sleep, her body continuing its quiet, essential work undisturbed by whatever faint stirrings had begun outside. Josiah slept equally deeply beside her. Down the short hallway, Hannah and Eli remained curled beneath their own shared quilt, and further along, in the room given over to her for this visit, Mercy's sister-in-law lay with her infant daughter tucked close, the whole household still held, for a while longer yet, in exactly the same deep, unbroken rest that had claimed it hours before. There would be time yet, plenty of it, before any of them actually needed to stir, before Mercy's own internal clock would eventually nudge her back toward full waking, before the fire needed uncovering and coaxing back to life, before the cow needed milking and the chickens needed tending, and the whole long useful business of another colonial day would begin asking, once again, for the particular steady attention Mercy brought to it, morning after morning, without complaint, without much conscious thought at all. For now, though, for this last remaining stretch of the night, there was only this: warmth, stillness, the particular deep peace of a house and a family entirely, completely at rest, held safely through the coldest hours by nothing more than careful preparation, patient love, and the slow, steady turning of a night that was, even now, however gradually, however invisibly, already beginning its long return toward light. Somewhere in her own drifting thoughts, back before sleep had fully claimed her that second time, Mercy had found herself thinking briefly ahead to December and to a particular quirk of her own community's calendar that still occasionally surprised newcomers or visitors from other colonies further south. Christmas, in a New England parish like Mercy's, was not treated as a holiday at all, not in any formal sense, and had not been for generations, a lingering habit inherited from the strict Puritan founders of the region, who had viewed the elaborate feasting and revelry associated with the day back in Old England as dangerously close to pagan excess dressed up in religious clothing, and had, in the colony's earlier decades, gone so far as to make its celebration formally illegal, punishable by an actual fine. That particular law had lapsed by Mercy's own time, but the underlying attitude toward the day had softened only slightly, and in most of the farming parishes scattered through this part of Massachusetts, the 25th of December remained, by custom if no longer strictly by law, an entirely ordinary working day. Josiah would rise and go to his workshop exactly as he did every other morning. Hannah would attend her lessons with Goodwife Cutler exactly as scheduled. There would be no special feast, no particular gathering, no exchange of gifts beyond, perhaps some small handmade token passed quietly between family members, with none of the ceremony a later century would eventually attach to the day. Mercy's own mother-in-law, considerably stricter in her religious observance than Mercy herself tended to be, viewed the whole matter with a certain quiet satisfaction, considering the day's lack of ceremony not a deprivation at all but a genuine point of proper, restrained faith, one holy day treated with exactly the same sober regularity as any other ordinary Tuesday. Mercy found herself, drifting there in the dark, thinking of Eli's small wooden horse again, nearly finished now on Josiah's workbench, intended for his birthday rather than for any particular winter holiday, and felt a small, private amusement at the thought of some distant future family, perhaps her own eventual grandchildren, celebrating that same December date with an entirely different kind of fuss and ceremony than her own household would ever think to give it. Traditions, she thought, sleepily now, had a way of shifting considerably more than people generally expected them to, even traditions that felt, from the inside of living them, as steady and unchangeable as the turning of the seasons themselves. The thought carried her gently back down towards sleep once more, the small quiet amusement of it dissolving slowly into the same deep wordless rest that had already claimed the rest of her sleeping household hours before. The winter stretching out ahead of the household, still weeks from truly settling in, existed for now mostly as anticipation, a season Mercy could picture clearly enough from 11 previous years of living through nearly identical versions of it, even as this particular one had not yet properly begun. She could already picture the evenings to come, considerably longer and darker than the ones just past. The whole family gathered closer around the hearth than autumn's milder evenings required, outdoor work largely suspended once the ground froze too hard for digging, and the days grew too short and too bitter for anything beyond the most essential outdoor chores. The spinning wheel, idle this particular evening, would see considerably heavier use through the coming months, Mercy working steadily through the season's carded wool, while Josiah turned his own attention to smaller indoor tasks, mending tools, carving, the occasional small repair around the house that summer's busier outdoor demands had left no time for. Storytelling would fill a good portion of those long winter evenings too, the same way it filled a portion of nearly every evening already, though winter's darkness and idleness always seemed to draw it out longer, richer, more elaborate. Josiah told stories his own father had told him, old tales about the town's earliest founding families, exaggerated, Mercy suspected, in various small ways with each retelling, though she never said so aloud, preferring to let Eli and Hannah both listen with the same wide-eyed absorption she remembered feeling herself as a child, hearing her own father's version of similar old stories by a similar fire. There would be genuine hardship folded into those coming months too, of course, the particular grinding monotony of a New England winter, weeks at a time with barely enough daylight to properly see by, the constant low-grade worry over whether the stored food and stored wood would truly stretch through until spring, the simple physical discomfort of a cold that no amount of banked fire and warming pans ever entirely defeated. Mercy did not romanticize the season ahead, not really, not after 11 winters of living through its genuine difficulties firsthand. But there was comfort folded into it too, the particular closeness of a family drawn tightly together by necessity, evenings that stretched long and unhurried in a way summer's busy demands never quite allowed, a whole different rhythm of life, waiting patiently just beyond the calendar's next turning, familiar and in its own particular way, really, quietly welcome. By the time the sky beyond the bedroom window had shifted from full black to the deep, indistinct grey that comes some while before any true colour returns to the world, a full chorus of birds had taken up the work that single early riser had only tested hours before, a scattered, growing conversation of calls moving across the still dark fields and hedgerows, each voice joining in until the whole quiet morning air carried the sound of it, faint but unmistakable through the bedroom's small glass panes. Mercy remained asleep through most of this, her body not yet ready to fully surface, though somewhere in the last stretch of that grey wakening hour, her sleep grew lighter, thinner, closer now to the surface of waking than it had been at any point since she first drifted back down after the night's brief middle conversation with Josiah. Dreams, if she still held any, grew simpler now, more fragmented, closer to actual thought than to the deep wordless imagery of full sleep, and somewhere in that thinning, lightening state, she became distantly aware of the particular grey quality of the light now visible even through her closed eyes. The room around her no longer entirely dark. The rooster 2 farms over, the same one whose earlier crowing had marked her very first waking hours ago, now took up its call again, considerably more insistent this time, joined a few minutes later by their own household's own smaller flock, Hannah's carefully, if inconsistently, named hens beginning their own morning stirring out in the yard. Duke shifted in the barn, rose, shook himself once, and settled again briefly, not quite ready either to fully abandon the last comfortable stretch of the night. The oxen, too, began their own slow, heavy movements, the particular low sounds of large animals stirring reaching faintly through the walls into the quiet house beyond. None of it woke Mercy fully, not yet. The whole household still held in that particular soft, unhurried threshold between night and true morning. The fire still banked, the frost outside still thick across the yard, the actual work of the coming day still some minutes off yet. For now, there was only this quiet, gradual gathering of light and sound, the whole sleeping world easing itself, gently and without any particular urgency, back toward wakefulness, exactly the way it had eased itself into sleep so many hours before, one soft, patient layer at a time. There is something I find myself wanting to leave you with here at the edge of this particular story. Something about the sheer, accumulated weight of all those small, careful, repeated acts that filled Mercy Whitfield's days and nights, acts so ordinary to her that she rarely paused to consider them remarkable at all. The chewed twig each morning, the linen changed and aired, the curtsy calibrated just so, the trencher soaked through with the day's stew, the warming pan carried room to room, the fire banked each night with the same careful, practiced hands. Taken alone, none of it amounts to very much. A single morning's tooth cleaning, a single evening's mending, a single night's careful fire tending. These are small things, easily overlooked, the kind of small things a person does thousands of times across a life without ever once stopping to properly notice them. And yet stacked together, night after night, season after season, year after year, they become something considerably larger than the sum of their small individual parts. They become an entire life, lived carefully and thoroughly within its own particular time and place, following its own particular strange and specific customs, most of which would strike a modern visitor as almost unrecognizably odd, and all of which felt to the woman actually living them simply like the plain, unremarkable shape of an ordinary day. That is perhaps the thing worth sitting with longest, once the specific details begin to blur together and fade the way details from any long story eventually do. Every strange, quaint, curious habit we have walked through together tonight, the chewed twigs and the cross-hatched letters and the bundling boards and the groaning cakes, belonged at the time to people who found nothing remotely strange about any of it at all. It was simply how a Tuesday worked, how a Thursday wedding worked, how a Sunday sermon worked, how a Wednesday bedtime worked. We are the ones, standing at this particular distance, who get to find it curious, get to marvel at how differently an ordinary evening could be constructed, get to feel, faintly, the strange vertigo of realizing that our own ordinary evenings, our own unremarkable daily habits, will very likely strike some future audience, centuries from now, as equally odd, equally quaint, equally worth a slow, curious story told late at night to help somebody fall asleep. Someone, somewhere far ahead of us, may someday find our own bedtime routines every bit as peculiar as we found Mercy's chewed twig and her linen shift and her carefully banked fire tonight, and there is something almost tender in imagining that, a whole unbroken chain of ordinary nights, each one strange to the ones that follow, each one simply, quietly sufficient to the person actually living inside it. Mercy slept on, there in that quiet grey hour, undisturbed by any of these larger thoughts, which belonged, after all, entirely to the telling of her story, rather than to her own sleeping mind. She knew nothing of centuries yet to come, nothing of how her own small, careful habits might someday sound to some distant listener drifting towards sleep, in a warm, unfamiliar room lit by no candle or fire at all, but by some soft, steady glow she could not have begun to imagine. She knew only the particular comfort of her own bed, her own husband breathing steadily beside her, her own children settled safely down the hall, her own house holding its quiet, banked warmth around the whole sleeping family, exactly as it was meant to. The frost outside would hold a while longer yet before the sun finally climbed high enough to begin its slow work of melting it away. The birds would keep up their scattered, growing chorus a good while before the household actually stirred to meet the day properly. The fire would keep its careful, banked promise a good while longer still, coals holding steady beneath their blanket of ash, patient and ready, waiting for Mercy's own hands to uncover them again and coax them back into the flame that would warm another whole ordinary day. For now, though, there was only this: a woman asleep beside her husband in a small farmhouse bedroom in a small New England town on an ordinary October night in the middle of the 18th century, her whole life built from exactly the kind of small, careful, repeated habits we have spent this evening walking slowly through together. Nothing dramatic, nothing especially remarkable, at least not by the measure her own world used to judge such things. Simply a full day, well lived, followed by a full night, well rested, the same quiet pattern repeating itself now, as it had for 11 years, as it would for years yet to come, one ordinary, carefully tended evening at a time. Somewhere in that last stretch of grey, settling quiet, the whole shape of the coming day still waited, patiently, just past the edge of sleep. The milking still to be done, the fire still to be coaxed back to life, the bread from baking day still to be sliced for breakfast, Eli still to be gently convinced to leave the warmth of his bed, Hannah still to recite whatever half-garbled proverb she had most recently claimed from the almanac. None of it pressed forward yet, none of it needed to. The whole ordinary machinery of another colonial day sat simply waiting, unhurried, the same way it had waited every single morning of Mercy's married life, ready to begin again exactly when she was ready to meet it, and not one moment sooner. There is a particular mercy, if you will forgive the small unintended pun, in a life built this thoroughly around repetition, around the same tasks performed the same careful way morning after morning, season after season. It asks for very little improvisation. It offers, in exchange for its genuine hardships, a kind of steady, dependable shape, each day recognizable from the one before it, each night's rest earned by the same familiar accumulation of familiar labor. Mercy had never once needed to wonder, waking each morning, what her day would generally require of her. She simply knew, the way she knew the particular creak of her own kitchen floorboard, the way she knew exactly how long her own oven's bricks needed to heat before the bread could safely go in. There is something almost restful in that certainty itself, layered somewhere beneath even the deepest, most literal rest of an actual night's sleep, a kind of quiet trust that tomorrow, whatever else it held, would very likely resemble today closely enough to be met without any particular fear. And that is where we will leave her, and leave this particular quiet corner of history, Mercy Whitfield asleep in her own warm bed on an October night nearly 300 years behind us now, her whole ordinary, carefully tended world folded gently into rest around her, the fire banked, the frost settling, the birds beginning their own slow, scattered morning conversation somewhere out beyond the walls. Perhaps, somewhere in the particular strangeness of all this, the chewed twig and the cross-hatched letter and the trencher soaked through with stew, you found something oddly comforting rather than simply curious. I think I do. Most nights I sit down to tell a story like this one. There is a kind of comfort in remembering just how many different ways an ordinary life has been built and lived, across how many different centuries, in how many different small farmhouses scattered across how many different quiet corners of the world, each one following its own particular rhythm of waking and working and resting, each one, in its own time, feeling entirely unremarkable to the people actually living inside it. I hope, wherever you are tonight, whatever town or country or quiet room you happen to be listening from, that some small measure of that same rest has found its way to you as well by now, that your own shoulders have dropped a little further from your ears, that your own breathing has slowed to match whatever steady rhythm sleep prefers, that whatever small accumulated weight the day left behind has begun, gently, to loosen its grip, the same way Mercy's did, one soft, unhurried layer at a time. The house grows quiet now, the candle has burned down, the story, such as it was, has reached its own particular close, and there is nothing left to do but let the dark hold you, warm and undemanding, exactly the way it held her. Somewhere behind you, if you like, you can imagine your own version of that same banked fire, tended and ready, holding its quiet warmth through whatever hours remain of your own night, coals settling low and steady beneath their own soft blanket of ash, patient the way Mercy's fire was patient, needing nothing further from you now except the simple, unhurried act of letting go. You do not need a straw tick or a warming pan or a hand-stitched book hidden beneath a false bottom to understand, at the end of it, the same simple thing Mercy understood without ever needing to put it into words at all. A day well spent deserves a night well rested, and a night well rested is waiting for you now, patient and close, exactly the way it was always going to be. Sleep well.